Resident Evil is currently my favorite active franchise in the entire gaming industry. It is a series that has a variety of quality titles and releases new ones very often that are almost all quite good. But there wasn't always a time when the series was at the top of my list. In fact, there was a time when I hadn't played most of them at all, which was just a couple years ago. So today, we're compiling my videos in the classic games, RE1, RE2, RE3, Code Veronica, Remake, and RE0. And those videos also containing further thoughts on the remakes of RE2 and RE3 in there as well. These are some of my favorite videos from back in 2022, so hope people enjoy experiencing them all over again. But before I even think about it, we need to talk about Sword of Convallaria, who's the sponsor of today's video. Sword of Convallaria is a game you can play on Steam and mobile devices. The game is trying to emulate the feel of a classic JRPG like Fire Emblem or the more recent game Octopath Traveler, and uses a pixel graphic aesthetic to give a nostalgic feel while also feeling like a game made in the 21st century at the same time. Developed and published by XD Entertainment, Sword of Convallaria will give fans of those kinds of games hours of content to explore and characters to unlock and story to experience. In an ancient continent called Rodinia, there's a small but wealthy country called Iria that is known for the material Luxite, which is infused with magical powers. Turns out that other nations want Luxite, and that has caused power struggles and other tensions between factions, which sets the stage for the opening of the game, the riot in Wave Run City. How the combat works is thus. You get a bunch of different character types to deploy on the field and use when it's your turn. You decide where the characters are placed on a grid and then what attacks they'll do. For example, the player character uses distance-based magic attacks, but then another character you recruit early on uses a sword and shield, so you need to be near the enemies for them to do damage. And along the way, you'll experience the story with over 120 hours of storytelling with branching paths and even multiple endings. In it, you get to see a variety of good-looking pixel graphics with some cool lighting effects and particle effects as well. If you're interested, which you absolutely, positively are, like I said, you can get the game on Steam and mobile devices. Thanks again to Sword of Convallaria for sponsoring this video. Link in the description. Now, back to regularly scheduled programming.
Well, folks, we're finally getting around to this, huh? Over a year ago, I did videos on the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, and in those videos, I claimed that I wanted to do an entire retrospective on the mainline Resident Evil series, starting with the classics on the PlayStation 1. However, I just never got around to it. Despite having put this project off for a year now, I'm pretty stoked to dive into it nonetheless. Resident Evil is one of the most iconic and influential franchises in all of video games, defining an entire genre of games that would follow, and the series would continue to do that throughout its long lifespan. However, what makes my perspective on this series different and what makes these videos different from the usual retrospectives I've done is that I've barely played the series. Prior to making this video, I had played and beaten the 2002 remake of Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 4, the 2019 remake of Resident Evil 2, and the 2020 remake of Resident Evil 3. RE4 and RE2 Remake are two of my favorite games of all time though. I have over 100 hours in both of those games. I've touched the other games, that is why there's footage for them in the videos I did last year, but I've never beaten most of them. And that's because I wanted this video series to be me documenting my thoughts as I play through the RE games for the first time as we work our way up to the games I have played. So, without further ado, I say we just get started with the 1996 release, Resident Evil. So what exactly is this game? Well, if you don't know, it birthed the genre called survival horror, since the game sees you trying to survive the night trapped in a mansion filled with zombies with a limited amount of supplies. Upon starting a new game, you get the choice between two campaigns, one of them starring Chris Redfield and the other one with Jill Valentine. I can get into the differences between the two later, however the structure of the game and the gameplay is the same between the two, so I want to start with those basic elements. The game was released in the mid-90s, like I said, so you'd naturally expect when playing it today, 26 years later, that getting into it would be a bit awkward. This was the largest shift the industry had seen, going from the perfected 2D gameplay of the early 90s into the experimental, innovative 3D of the mid to late 90s. What developers quickly realized back then was that making your characters feel good to control was more important than ever now that the player can roam around in a 3D space. Control is one of the biggest things that separated the good games from the bad in this era. On that note, Resident Evil has held up quite well in this category. Back when it first came out, the PlayStation controller didn't have an analog stick like the N64's controller did, so they had to make the movement feel natural while the player's ability to move was limited in 4 directions. In RE, the camera is fixed. You cannot control the angles you view the action from. You'll get into a room with the camera pointed at your character, and as you move around, the camera will shift to a different perspective. Having these fixed angles eliminates the need for camera control as the devs just set what you're seeing at any given moment, which leads to effective jump scares, but also balance difficulty as they then place the enemies precisely with the camera's position in mind so that you can react accordingly. but none of that speaks to the actual control. Simply put, moving the D-pad up moves the character forward, down is back, and left and right go, you guessed it, left and right. You can also hold, say, up and left at the same time if you want to turn at an angle. This is very intuitive and blends together really well with limited camera. Sometimes your character will face the screen while you run, and other times you'll face away from it, but the D-pad is relative to the character, not the camera. For example, what this means is that in one angle, Chris or Jill will face the camera, and in the next, the camera will be behind you or above your head. Which direction forward is doesn't change when this happens because up will always move Chris or Jill in the direction they're facing. It's actually really simple and easy to play, even if explaining it sounds more complicated than it really is. Some games with fixed camera angles do get a bit jittery when moving the character during a camera angle shift, and so, my not having any hiccups here with this game from so long ago speaks really well of the controls. The only issue I have is less with the handling and more with the moveset. Chris and Jill walk backwards when pressing the down button. Simple, but it does present a problem when enemies are around I'm trying to get some distance. You don't have a way to quickly turn around, you need to spin around and hope the enemies aren't close enough to launch an attack. But overall, the game's controls work really well, and because it's so simple, it's easy to get into. But the game's actual design also holds up really well. The idea of the game is for you to escape the Spencer mansion you're trapped inside of, and to do that, you're going to have to explore a pretty decent bit. When you start out, you have almost no equipment on you, but as you explore, you'll gain new ways around this maze. I liken it to a Metroidvania, where the appeal is finding new items that allow you to access areas you couldn't before, which grant items you need to further explore. I'd say the game has held up in this category because the appeal is quite simple. At the start, you'll be unable to open certain doors, and the game will tell you that this door has a carving of a sword on it. So when you find the sword key, you get an instant aha moment and go back to that door you couldn't get into earlier in the hopes something really good is hiding behind it. Like in Chris's playthrough when you find the broken shotgun, it must be good for something, and it turns out that there's a real shotgun in this room here, but taking it from the wall activates a trapped ceiling that will fall on you. This is where you take out the broken shotgun and put that on the wall, which allows you to get a real shotgun while avoiding the falling ceiling set piece. The game pulls the same trick when you take this golden shield from this room, but doing so causes the door to shut. But if you take the shield from above the fire pit in the dining room and put it in the place of the golden shield, you can escape. But then putting the golden shield in the fireplace shield's place causes the grandfather clock to move, which reveals a hidden key you need to get into the yawns area, which is hiding one of the crests you need to get into the courtyard. As I stated, this appeal is quite simple, but it repeatedly targets your reward system by granting you items you need to progress for solving its puzzles. Those items being required to solve a different problem, which then grants you more access to the rest of the house. I mean, how could you get sick of it? Especially since, for the most part, I think the solutions are pretty intuitive. Like how you use the armor key to get into this room with floor vents that put toxic gas in the air, and to stop it you have to move these two statues over to the vents to grab another crest to get into the courtyard. If the solutions to these things were way more obtuse, then players might get annoyed more than they'd be satisfied. Not to say these are the most taxing things in the brain, they're definitely not that, but it's still intuitive, which makes solving it satisfying. Some of the later areas requiring you to think outside the box a little more than you did at the beginning, like how this room in the lab features the same gas gimmick from the house, but now you just need to consider the positioning of yourself in these boxes you use to cover the vents, and spacing the boxes apart enough to fit the stepladder between them to get into the next room. Or the caves where you can't get behind the statue you need to push, so you move the statue in front of this wall that pushes out when you apply the crank to the peg next to it. You can then put the wall back where it belongs, and then you can push the statue. The only time I didn't feel like the puzzle solving was intuitive in this game was when you have to prepare the chemical V-Jolt that kills Plant 42. Even if you know how to mix the chemicals correctly, you still have to seek out the instructions to even be able to use the chemicals. But aside from that, I think Resident Evil is a fun game to play for the first time because of its progression and simple puzzle solving. But the fun doesn't stop when the first playthrough's up. The game uses its exploratory elements to breed replay value. When you play the game a second time, you'd likely remember the key item locations and what you do with those items, and so now you can find fun in a second run because you'll get through the game faster than you did the first time, because you know what items you need to bring into a room to solve a puzzle before you even get there, so you can cut down on backtracking by preparing in advance. You'll die less because you're more familiar with boss and enemy patterns. You'll know what weapons are the most effective on late game encounters and save ammo for that, and just get through it like it's nobody's business. Every time you play the game from then on, you'll get a faster and faster time at the end after the credits roll, which is an entirely different kind of satisfaction from what you got in the first playthrough. To tie it all back together, Resident Evil has a simple appeal, controls that are easy to get to grips with, and it's got design that's inherently satisfying on your first playthrough and your sixth. This is a lot of the same praise I gave to the remake of Resident Evil 2 when I did a video on that game last year. It played like a contemporary third-person shooter, but had these Metroidvania elements that are inherently fun to engage with on your first playthrough, and on your however many that I've done at this point. Which is, in my opinion, a testament to how well Resident Evil holds up because its basic design principles are still engaging in games released over 20 years later like Resident Evil 7, 8, and RE2 make. You might say that playing a game like this multiple times kind of kills one of its bigger draws, the horror aspect. I mean, if you run through a haunted house 5 times in a row, it's not going to be as scary as it was the first time, right? Well, to that, I agree. However, it should be clear from what I said that this game is far more than whatever scare value it has. It's replayable because of the way it's designed. Which is good because once you've seen all the surprises and the jump scares the game pulls, it's actually quite exploitable when it comes to enemies. For example, the zombies that litter the house can be killed with your guns, but that permanently removes them from the game. Kill an enemy and it's gone for good. That's obviously how it would work if you shot an enemy dead, but the problem is that if you value the threat level of the enemies, the game loses that when you can just kill a room of enemies and then have that room be completely safe for the next hour or so of gameplay. But that's not a problem to me, because in my case, I strategically choose what enemies to kill. Not all of them will get in your way, so the ones that do have to go, but in some rooms like the spiders in the ceiling in this hallway, you could just outrun them, so it's not even worth wasting bullets on them. Needless to say, the AI isn't that intelligent in this game, but it becomes rewarding again on repeat playthroughs as you now have the knowledge on which enemies are worth killing and which you can avoid. It's strategy, which once more comes from repeat playthroughs as you get through the game quicker. My point is, the game is too exploitable for it to retain a lot of its horror value, but that doesn't mean that I think it has none. I don't intend to say that anyone over the age of like 10 will be shaking in their boots playing Resident Evil 1 on PlayStation, but like I said, playing it for the first time does have some surprises like the Cerberus dogs diving through the window in this hallway, or the little jump scares like Plant 42's vine grabbing you by the throat when you pass by this hole in the wooden floor in the guardhouse. The best surprise came from the middle of the game. After you escape the mansion, you go to the guardhouse, which has more items you need to further explore the mansion so that you can then get to the underground and finally the lab. But the second visit to the mansion addresses my criticism from earlier where the zombies will stay dead when you shoot them down. I was honestly expecting the trip back to the house to be fairly simple since I cleared most of the enemies, but that's when the super powerful hunters enter the house and roam the halls trying to kill you. So you might have thought that you were in for an easy time, but now you have to contend with new enemies that are tougher than ever. I have to admit, when this hunter jumped down from the top of the screen in this hallway, that was an actual oh shit moment. That kind of thing isn't there on the second playthrough, but RE1, as a horror video game, is able to scare you in a way that only a video game can. Something that will still be present even on repeat runs of the game. In order to save your game, you'll need to use an item called an ink ribbon. You can find these throughout the game, and you can take them to typewriters that are tucked away in safe rooms with no enemies or puzzles. Here you can also use the item box to store things you don't need right now but will later, or just don't want to carry around period. But as I was saying, ink ribbons are finite, and while most players will have more than enough to get through the game, if you haven't saved your game recently and you start taking damage from an enemy like the hunters, things get really tense as you know that if you die, you go right back to the title screen and then must continue from your last save. Instant tension comes from this, and decision making is you might not want to use your ink ribbon now thinking you're going to be confident with this part of the game. Being proven right will feel very satisfying, but being proven wrong will have disastrous consequences. It's a great system. Due to the fact that I wasn't sure what to expect going into the original version of this game, I decided to pick Jill on my first playthrough, and that's because I already know that Jill's playthrough is definitely easier than Chris's. First, it's the little things. For example, I mentioned earlier that in Chris's playthrough, getting the shotgun requires you to find the broken one and put that where the working shotgun was. This can be done in Jill's playthrough, however, a big difference is that you can just grab the working shotgun, activate the falling ceiling, but then Barry will save Jill and you got a free shotgun, when Chris receives no such luck. Barry also gives Jill a lockpick, a permanent part of your inventory that doesn't even take up an item slot. Jill can just unlock desks and lock doors that don't have a big key required with reckless abandon. As Chris, you need to find tiny keys throughout the house that take up an item slot in order to do that. Jill also gets more weapons. The basic Beretta handgun, the shotgun, the bazooka, and the magnum. Chris also gets the Beretta, the shotgun, and the magnum, but he doesn't get a bazooka. You instead find a flamethrower in the underground, but you need to leave it behind in order to open the lock on the door that leads you to the lab. These things are tiny enough on their own, but then Chris also has 6 item slots compared to Jill's 8. The inventory screen in this game really irked me, but not in a way where I can hold it against the game. If you pick up an item, it's in your inventory until you either use it or find an item box to get rid of it. It would be really convenient to just get rid of non-essential items on the fly when you decide you don't want them anymore, like Chris's tiny keys, so you can make space for more important things you might come across, but that's just not a thing. I say I can't fault the game because it wasn't an accident. I mean, when you open all the doors that the sword key opens, for example, the game will then tell you can get rid of that now and it will discard it for you. But for all the rest of the items, you just have to plan for that sort of thing, leaving some space in the inventory. But as Chris, that can be a much bigger challenge because he only has 6 item slots as is. Chris's campaign is the hard mode of the game by far, because he doesn't even have any strengths to counteract the weaknesses he has compared to Jill. However, I still thought it was a fun game to play as both characters since the limitations on Chris made it a semi-new experience, especially since the story plays out slightly differently, like Jill using the V-Jolt on Plant 42 herself and Chris getting caught by the monster as she then switched to Rebecca to help him by using V-Jolt, then switching back to Chris to kill the thing. That sort of stuff. But if we're talking about the story, it's obviously time to address the thing everyone watching this video was expecting. The infamous cutscenes. I mean this genuinely. Resident Evil is home to some of the worst acting I have ever heard in my life. You could point to any scene and find lines that are just delivered in a way that sound completely unnatural.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
The wrong inflections used given the context of the scene.
This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant! Chris? Stop it.
Wesker, you're pitiful.
Bizarre dialogue that always sounds out of place.
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things.
Lines that make no sense.
Do you think we could see Tyrant now?
Barry, you're so optimistic.
And comedic overacting on top of all the other previously mentioned issues.
What? Oh! Oh no!
I emphasize how this might be the worst acting I've ever heard in my life, and that's because I can play Sonic Adventure largely thinking its acting is just mediocre across the board rather than outright bad. So I mean that I won't jump the gun on talking about the acting like that if I didn't mean it. This game, I think it's tiers below Mega Man X4, which came out the year after this, and that's saying something. However, I also don't mind how bad the acting is in this game because it is hilarious to watch unfold. I played some pretty infamous examples just now, but I really do mean that every cutscene is a riot in this game. Especially the ones that aren't usually talked about, they caught me off guard even more. Like this cutscene in Chris's playthrough where he rescues Jill and she tries telling you that Wesker betrayed them, something you would have just learned in the previous segment of gameplay. She says,
Wesker is here. He's...
The music stops, Chris pauses and says,
Oh, I know. Anyway, let's get out of here.
That's one of the hardest laughs I had in the game. An emotional moment of two teammates reunited, discussing their leader being a traitor. And he goes, oh yeah, I know. Anyway, another laugh I had was in Jill's playthrough when Wesker reveals his true plans. Going forward in the RE series, Wesker is an important character, so when you see him in his debut game be so pathetic, it's really funny. If you get Jill's best ending, Wesker doesn't even lead you to the Tyrant. Barry just knocks the guy out in one hit.
I'm going to show you the tyrant.
I really didn't see that coming. It's the juxtaposition of what I know about Wesker from later games and his laughable appearance here that made it extra funny. While I'm talking about funny cutscenes though, I want to mention that some cutscenes are pre-rendered featuring the areas in the game. This cutscene where the hunter is chasing you for the first time got a big chuckle out of me. I mean, this monster is dashing towards your current location and then casually opens the door like a normal person and then just keeps charging towards you. It's like the monster's thinking,
I'm gonna tear Jill limb from limb.
okay, don't want to cause any property damage. Now, as I was saying,
They won't even be able to recognize Chris when I'm done with him.
and let me slowly open the door for dramatic effect, and done. To say the acting and cutscenes of Resident Evil have aged poorly would not only be underselling it, it would also be a lie. Critics at the time across the board mentioned this game's really cheesy script and shockingly out-of-place acting. Something I didn't see coming since you just look back at a game as old as this one and then feel like it must have been something people just accepted. Almost like the bad acting was just so normal in games back then that you'd think it didn't get much attention, but no, people were calling it out back in the reviews that were otherwise quite positive. Guys, even the UK Sega Saturn magazine was making fun of it. The magazine that's trying to get you to buy the game. Quote, cringeworthy American actors have been drafted by Capcom to shoot the horrific FMV intro. We sincerely hope these aren't the same actors who star in the official Resident Evil movie. See the news section. Unquote. I mean, damn. Although if we're talking about the Sega Saturn magazine, I guess that warrants a discussion on how many times Resident Evil has been ported to other consoles. The game debuted on PlayStation in 1996, but the game has been re-released a pretty decent amount of times since. In 1997, the Sega Saturn received a port of this game which sported new features, like a battle mode where you're ranked for fighting enemies and extra skins, but its bigger draw compared to the original PlayStation version was its higher resolution. The various backgrounds are less compressed on the Sega Saturn than they were on the PS1. You can also make out more details in the character models themselves. These days, I don't think a higher resolution in a 26-year-old game really matters that much. I mean, I like my old games being pixelated like you can see on the screen, so backgrounds being slightly less compressed on Saturn isn't really that big of a deal. I'm certainly not knocking the port, it's good, it has new features, it technically looks better than the PS1 release, even down to having a more complete looking UI compared to the PS1 text, but the PlayStation version of RE1 is far more accessible than the Saturn port, so its features just aren't worth it unless you're really curious about it. The game also got re-released on PlayStation twice more after it first came out. For reasons we might get into in the next video, Resident Evil 2 experienced some troubled development and had to be delayed. To hold people over, Capcom put out the director's cut of Resident Evil 1, which contained new content. But its biggest draw was that they were going to include the uncensored full-color footage from the intro. However, for copyright and localization issues, they accidentally shipped the director's cut with the original cutscenes. I can't imagine how many players felt ripped off by that. The PC release of the game did include that footage though, and you can find it on YouTube quite easily. Despite that big blunder, the director's cut adds a lot of worthwhile content to the game. Mainly a range mode where the item locations, enemy placements, and camera angles have been altered to give you a new experience with the same game. The enemies are much more aggressive though, so that caught me off guard, but at the same time the rate of headshots I was getting really increased when playing on this difficulty. So play it at your own risk, I suppose. The biggest draw for me is that the game's auto-aim system from the Japanese release made it into the English version in the director's cut. How this works is that by pressing R1, the aim button, Chris or Jill will immediately target the nearest enemy and your shot will most likely hit them. In the original English release, you had to manually turn your gun towards the enemy and hope your depth perception was good enough to make it work. Fighting the hunters in the original release is far more difficult than it is on DX because you had to try and target these fast-moving enemies for 4 shotgun blasts straight. I actually got used to it when I played it, but after a playthrough on DX, I'm not going back. They later released the game on PlayStation again once the DualShock controller was released. Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition. What can you say? They clearly knew they had a hit game on their hands. This one added analog stick movement, however, I don't even feel the need to use it because these controls were, like I mentioned towards the beginning, so heavily geared towards the D-pad that the analog stick feels inferior to play with. However, that's not the most noteworthy thing about the DualShock Director's Cut. They decided to redo the game's entire soundtrack. For the most part, I think the new music is good enough. I enjoyed both the original soundtrack and the new one. I think the old music's more iconic, so it's got that going for it, but overall I could take either one. However, this soundtrack has one quite infamous addition to the mansion's basement. Yeah, don't know where that one went wrong. Although when you already know it's coming, it does lose some of that comedic value. Not much, but some. It's like what I was saying about the most infamous cutscenes, the ones I didn't know of were a lot funnier. And in the case of the music, it was the guardhouse basement that caught me the most by surprise. It's mostly okay, but there's just this part of it that goes like this. It pierced my ears every time I heard it. But besides those two, the new music was just fine for me. I was just saying that Capcom clearly knew they had a hit game on their hands, and so much so, they tried porting this PlayStation game to the Game Boy Color. This project never saw the light of day, however, what was finished of it, almost the whole game, leaked a few years back. I can't say it looks super fun to play, but this is RE1 compressed so much to fit on hardware it was never intended for. This is a very interesting piece of Resident Evil history, and on a technical merit, it demonstrates a lot of expertise. It's probably for the best that it got cancelled. Like I said, a PS1 game being downscaled for the Game Boy Color of all things was just never a good match. But it is a shame that the effort had to go down the drain, I suppose. But while we're talking about different versions of RE, in 2002, the game was remade from the ground up on the GameCube. However, I thought that Resident Evil Remake was worthy of its own video, so we'll revisit that subject at a later date. The last version of the original Resident Evil was released in 2006 on the Nintendo DS, now going by Resident Evil Deadly Silence in this release. I gotta admit, I'm pretty surprised to say that the DS version of RE1 is actually really good. On the downside, this is the lowest resolution version of the game, so if that matters to you, the DS version is the weakest. However, there are a C's worth of upsides to this port. For one, they actually went to the effort of creating new character models and animations. It's the little things that show effort went in, you know? But in terms of more important additions, they added in features from later games that improve the RE1 experience, like the quick turn from Resident Evil 3 and the dedicated knife button from Resident Evil 4. The DS version still has the auto aim, and it has these new features that make the game easier to handle. But best of all, you can skip the cutscenes. Yeah, in the original versions of this game, you had to watch all the cutscenes in full, but with the press of a button on DS, skipped. Even better, in the original games, going through doors would see you sit through this screen where the door opens against a black background, or you'd see a stair climbing image when going upstairs. These are loading screens, I'm sure, but it really breaks up the pace of the original. On DS, you can skip those too. When I first saw you could skip door transitions, I knew that the DS version of RE1 is the best official version of the game that has ever existed. Was not expecting to say that, but it is. The only drawback to the experience I could mention are these new DS exclusive puzzles and combat screens, but those are exclusive to the new Rebirth mode. If you pick Classic mode, you can get the original experience with the new enhancements without the extra DS gimmicky fluff, and that's genuinely the best RE1 experience you could possibly get. I highly recommend the DS version if you ever feel like playing RE1 without just playing the actual remake. But that 5-minute discussion of the game's various ports and re-releases was an aside to what I was actually talking about. I was going over the laughable cutscenes, but I basically squeezed all the juice out of that lemon. What I want to go into now is the game's actual story. In previous reviews, it's been pretty clear how I can enjoy a story for what it's trying to achieve regardless of how well they actually pull it off, because I respect the effort. In this game's case, I must admit, I was pretty into the events of the game despite the presentation of it. I was glued to the opening of the game, which is done in full live action, going for an Evil Dead type vibe, and from there it was consistently holding my attention. The story goes that in the summer of 1998, a series of bizarre murders have taken place in the Arklay Mountains outside of Raccoon City, where victims were found eaten. The Bravo team of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS for short, was sent in to investigate, but they quickly lost contact with them. So now, members of the Alpha team, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and their leader, Albert Wesker, personally look into the matter. But the zombie dogs chase them into the Spencer mansion where they hope it's safe. In Chris's story, Barry is not with them when they get inside, as a gunshot draws Chris into another room where a zombie is eating a member of the Bravo team, and when he gets back, Wesker and Jill are gone. Chris then needs to find them before escaping, coming into contact with Rebecca Chambers, a member of the Bravo team, as the two work together to escape. In Jill's story, Chris is missing from the start, Wesker disappears shortly after that, so Jill has to work with Barry to find the team and escape. But Barry is acting really suspicious. Like I said, I enjoyed watching the story of the game play out, and that's because, say I hadn't played the remake a couple years ago, I had no knowledge of the game before playing it today. And when you look at it from that lens, it's pretty interesting to see the mystery unfold. I mean, this house is littered with zombies and other monstrosities, and none of the characters think that's normal, so what's going on here? As you explore the house, you find all these writings left behind by people who used to work here, like the one from the zombie hidden in a closet. His diary is full of notes as his mind is gradually deteriorating into a zombie. As you explore all the areas of the game, you'll learn that the Spencer Mansion is the hiding spot for the pharmaceutical company Umbrella's secret laboratory. Umbrella has been experimenting with bioweapons for a long time. I mean, they say that Plant 42 has been mutated so much that they don't even know what plant it was before they mutated it into what it is now. That's how deep it goes. The latest creation is a bioweapon called the Tyrant Virus, or the T-Virus for short. This leaked to the staff as they turned into zombies who went on to infect the rest of the house. Some monsters managed to escape, causing the murders that kicked off the story. As I mentioned before, Wesker is the leader of STARS, but he was secretly working for Umbrella. He sabotaged the Bravo team's helicopter so the Alpha team could be brought in, where he'd use the Alpha team to collect combat data on how those infected with the T-Virus fare against the living, and then kill them and destroy all the evidence of the lab and the experiments. In this game alone, you're interested in what Umbrella's up to as you gradually uncover more of the story as you get closer and closer to the lab. But even between the characters, things kept me interested. Wesker is the traitor, but throughout Jill's story, you have to work with Barry, who is as suspect as they come. I mean, he gives Jill a rope into a lower area and then accidentally drops it when she reaches the ground, that sort of thing. I'd imagine if you played this in 1996, you'd be waiting for the obvious reveal that he's evil. But he was actually under the control of Wesker, who you don't really think about much in Jill's playthrough because Barry gets more screen time. But Umbrella was threatening his family, so he had no choice but to help Wesker until he turns around and assists you. In Chris's story, Wesker's the only character you see besides Rebecca, so therefore it's pretty obvious that he's the one who's up to no good. However, I'm just saying I found the story and lore in this game to overall be pretty interesting, regardless of which character I was playing as. All in all, the game was setting up for a fun endgame, since I thought the earlier areas were tightly designed and I was curious to see how the story was going to conclude, for both unironic and ironic purposes. However, the last two areas, the underground and the lab, are both kind of underwhelming in this game. Even as late as Resident Evil 2 Remake, the nest area at the end of the game pales in comparison to the exploration of the RPD at the beginning. So Resident Evil climaxes not stacking up to the beginning of the game is certainly not something I can hold against this game uniquely. The reasons just happen to differ in all the games that I've played. In this game, it's mostly because I felt the last two areas were really short. The enemies in the lab are pretty tough, but if you know what you're doing, you'll get through it pretty easily because there aren't that many rooms and puzzles in the lab compared to the mansion, which I think would leave less of an impression on me if the final boss was more fun. Wesker shows the player character the Tyrant, and then you have to fight it, but he's the easiest boss in the game, requiring 6 Magnum shots to be taken down. Then you make a beeline for the helipad to escape. If you're Jill, then the best ending sees you escaping alongside Chris and Barry, and then in Chris's story you escape with Jill and Rebecca if you got the best ending, which I did in both stories. Of course, the Tyrant wasn't dead for good earlier, he busts out of the ground for a second go, and if you get enough hits in on him or evade his attacks for a minute or so, the helicopter pilot, Brad, will drop a rocket launcher for you to use, which I used as Jill within mere nanoseconds of being killed. Following that, you get one last live-action cutscene where all the characters escape on the chopper as the entire mansion explodes. In Jill's playthrough, it's because Wesker escaped and activated the self-destruct, and in Chris's run, Wesker is presumed dead and Rebecca intentionally blows the place to make sure the monsters don't escape and the lab can't be used again. After the game is over, you get ranked on your time, and you access a sort of New Game Plus mode where you get a key to this room here that grants you extra costumes to wear, but I didn't bother with that, because I thought the playtime I had with the game was quite enough. Not in a disparaging way, because in closing, I think Resident Evil is quite good. It's all been said in the video already. I mean, I was thoroughly engaged with my playthrough of this first game. It's not perfect, the controls could use some expansion, the later areas weren't as fun, but these are all things a good sequel could fix, which Resident Evil was obviously going to get. I mean, they re-released this first game on PlayStation 2 more times post-launch. The game was a critical and financial success, one of the best games from the early days of the PlayStation 1. I'm glad I finally got to play this landmark game and actually enjoyed it a lot and felt like, as a game, it held up really well. In 1998, the world received Resident Evil 2, a game that was set up from the start to be a hit, but in actuality, things weren't going well for this one behind the scenes. Development on Resident Evil 2 began shortly after the release of Resident Evil 1, with the first game's director, Shinji Mikami, taking a producer role on RE2 as the game would be directed by Hideki Kamiya instead. Kamiya, being someone who I'm obliged to mention, was responsible for the creation of my favorite game series of all time, Devil May Cry, but that's neither here nor there. Now, I said things weren't going well. It's not that the game was bad, it's just that it wasn't setting the world on fire. The game was going to be about a cop named Leon Kennedy and a college girl named Elza Walker dealing with Raccoon City getting infected with zombies, which isn't too dissimilar to the final game, but like I said, it just wasn't really coming together in a particularly exciting manner. The game was set to release in May of 1997, and when development was between 60 and 80% complete, it was announced that the game was going to be delayed to 1998 as the team would overhaul the game design in the hopes of reaching the desired quality standard. This is when Capcom first released the director's cut of Resident Evil 1 as a way to hold people over. These days, fans refer to the scrapped RE2 as Resident Evil 1.5, and you can play it too, as fans took the time to put a playable build of it together. From what I hear, people seem to agree that RE 1.5 is kinda boring, which was the reason why the team had scrapped it and started over. Thank goodness they had the ability to look at their work and realize they weren't happy with it and begin anew. Because the RE2 we know today is an iconic game, just like its predecessor, having introduced characters and ideas to the series that are just as recognizable as the ones from the first game. But, to close the lid on RE 1.5, maybe I'll give it a shot one day to give an opinion. I decided against it for this video because I believe we already have quite a lot to talk about with the Resident Evil 2 that we got in 1998. For starters, of the games I had yet to play in the Resident Evil series, the original RE2 was the one I was the most excited to play, and that's because of the fact that it's the original version of Resident Evil 2 from 2019. The remake of RE2 is without question one of my favorite games of all time. I have played it several times, beaten it with the best rank on every difficulty. It is just a superb game. So that had me really curious about how the original would compare. When I did a review on the remake last year, I was unsure of whether or not I wanted to play the original to compare them then, but decided to just review the remake as is and share why I love it so much, and then I do a whole RE retrospective to see how I felt about the older games. And so, here we are. If you want my full thoughts on how the remake plays, you can check out the review I did last year. This video is going to focus on my thoughts on the original, but I'm going to be comparing it to the remake a lot to see how it stacks up. So having said that, this is my take on the original 1998 PS1 classic, Resident Evil 2. The new director for RE2, Hideki Kamiya, believed the game was best off going for a more Hollywood action-inspired game compared to the more slow-paced horror vibe from the first game. And that was exactly what they delivered on. RE2 on PS1 was so big that it came on 2 discs, one for each of its protagonists. Disc 1 houses the campaign of Leon S. Kennedy, a rookie cop on his first day with the Raccoon City Police Department, and the other focuses on Claire Redfield, the sister of Chris Redfield from the first game. She's come to Raccoon City to find Chris, whose whereabouts are currently unknown. The both of them meet in the midst of a citywide outbreak that causes zombies to tour the streets en masse as they have to take refuge at the Raccoon City Police Station, which is also littered with zombies and other abominations. From there, the two campaigns go in very different directions, but I can save that for when we discuss the plot. I used that brief summary to set up the fact that they really wanted to take things to the next level after RE1. In RE2, the players dropped immediately into the action. The city's on fire and zombies are everywhere and you need to try to make it to the police station before the hordes overwhelm you. Compared to how the first game began with an air of mystery, this opening street section of RE2 puts on full display how much more intense this sequel is going to be. From there, I'd say the opening hour of RE2 was pretty challenging. On my first run for this video, I died 3 times in the first hour of playtime. If you played RE1 before this, the zombies won't be too threatening on their own because you're already familiar with their patterns. But RE2 serves its story of a zombie takeover and its design philosophy of upping the action by flooding the RPD with zombies. You'll walk into a room and like 5 or 6 zombies might make a beeline towards you immediately. And when that happens, the handgun you start with that holds like 15 bullets will suddenly feel pretty weak compared to what you're up against. Because of this, finding new weapons feels pretty exciting in RE2. Not that it wasn't in RE1, but RE2 just has so many more weapons in it, and with the enemy design I just described, you will actively feel like you can finally turn the tides against the zombies, like getting Claire's bowgun that fires 3 arrows at once, or the spark shot, the grenade launcher, and a flamethrower. Claire gets pretty decked out with powerful weapons in RE2, and it's really satisfying to shoot zombies dead with them when they previously gave you so much trouble. Leon's weapons aren't as powerful as Claire's on their own, but he does find upgrades for his weapons, like firing 3 shots from his handgun at once. Or my favorite, the part that you get to equip on your shotgun. Leon's shotgun was good before, but the sound effect that goes off from the upgraded version is just so satisfying to hear as it blasts multiple enemies at once. Love how it has so much kick that it'll send Leon back a bit and might cause the camera angle to change rapidly. It's part of the fun. Even with the firepower you can get in RE2, you never want to get super comfortable at the same time. In the first game, when you cleared a room of zombies, it would just be an empty room from then on until you revisited the house later in the game. But RE2 keeps the tension up with a simple change. Zombies will stay down when you kill them, but you never know what will be there when they're gone. RE2 introduces several new monsters you have to contend with, in addition to the ones you're already familiar with. Chief among them, the Licker, a monstrosity that can't see but has strong hearing as it uses its fast movement, sharp claws, and long tongue to tear you apart. At the start of the game, this connecting area from the upper east and west sides of the RPD will have zombies all around, but if you take care of them all, a Licker will show up later, right next to the ladder you use to climb up here. Things like that are sudden jump scares like arms busting through the boarded up windows of the RPD keeps the player on their toes, expecting danger around every corner, which allows Resident Evil 2 to still be a suspenseful game, but also leaving room for more exciting combat than RE1. On the note of enhancements, you'd expect a good sequel to make some quality of life upgrades. If you're impatient like I am, you will greatly appreciate the fact that RE2 has significantly faster tech speed than its predecessor. While replaying RE1 for the video I did last week, and probably halfway through my first run of the game, having to read every character of, "Will you pick up the green herb? Yes or no?" as it came on the screen was something I didn't like, but here the text goes by super quick. As for a mechanical change that leaves more of an impact, the game adds a whole new system to taking damage. By default, your health is in the green, the fine state, and as you take damage, you enter the caution state. Take even more damage and go into the danger state. This was in RE1, but in that game, your abilities didn't change with this, and in fact, you had to pause the game to even see what your health was. Now, your health is clearly visible just by looking at the character. When in the caution state, Leon and Claire will hold their hands on their sides, and when in the danger state, they'll slowly drag their feet across the ground as they move. It serves you by making it so you can tell if you need to heal, but also encourages you not to be reckless with enemies because getting to the danger state makes it incredibly difficult to survive if you don't have a healing item. So the slow movement with low health is a punishment for not being careful with enemies. Having said all that, you might be wondering, with the combat being given more attention in this game, how does the exploration factor from RE1 carry over into the sequel? Resident Evil 2 is still a game focused on non-linear environments with item-based progression. The RPD, the area the player runs around in for the first half of the game, has loads of puzzles and locked doors to get through as you have to find the different shaped keys in order to get through different rooms. It's the exact same appeal as the first game. You find a door that says it can only be opened with the heart key, you finally find that and are excited to go see what lies behind the door you couldn't get through before. You also get that same excitement with a series of puzzles that leads to one solution. Like you have to put these statues in the right spot of this room to get the red gem from the statue in the middle, but also need to light the fire in this room with your lighter to reveal another red gem. Putting these two in the storage room on the second floor will then reveal a key item you need to escape the RPD. This kind of design is just inherently satisfying to pull off. However, I will say I think RE1's mansion portion is more satisfying to replay compared to the RPD and RE2. Like I said, RE2 has all the same exploration appeal as RE1, but I just think the first game had more puzzles and items to speak of inside the house. And then, once you escape to find the guardhouse, you then have to go back to the house one more time to get what you need to reach the underground. And when doing so, you explore many rooms you hadn't seen before, like the basement or the top floor that requires the elevator to access. In the RE1 review, I said a major source of replay value for RE1 was replaying it and seeing just how much quicker you could get through the mansion portion, which still stands for RE2, but to compare, it took me over 4 hours just to reach the underground in RE1 in the first playthrough, and in RE2, it took me about 2.5 to reach the sewers. So while the exploration of RE2 is the same kind of appeal as RE1, I just think the original game has more of it. But RE2 makes up for it with one of its more exciting features. In the first game, you had to pick between playing the game as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, both characters experiencing different story beats. However, there was no connection between the two storylines, as Jill rescues Chris at the end of her campaign, where he seemingly was stuck the entire game, and Chris saves Jill at the end of his campaign in the exact same fashion. So what the actual story of RE1 is something that's up to interpretation. Hell, RE2 says that Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and Barry all escape the mansion, but there's no scenario of RE1 where that happens. Resident Evil 2 put much more into the two playthroughs dynamic than RE1 did. As stated earlier, Disc 1 is where you play as Leon Kennedy, and Disc 2 is where you play as Claire Redfield. On their own, these two campaigns are distinguished in meaningful ways, like Leon meeting a woman named Ada Wong as they try to reach Umbrella's secret lab together, and how Claire runs into a little girl named Sherry Birkin who she has to protect. The two leads interact with different characters, like Leon encountering this reporter who got locked up in the basement of the RPD, and Claire interacting with the creepy chief of police. Although, different plot points and characters was what RE1 already did. It's how Leon and Claire's stories connect in RE2 that's the innovative feature. When you hit New Game on the title screen of either disc, it'll play the story from that character's perspective. When you save your game, it will be listed as Claire A or Leon A. When you beat it and save your game again, your Claire A file will become a Leon B file. When popping in Leon's disc, you can then load the Leon B storyline and experience a different version of Leon's story that follows up upon Claire's A scenario and vice versa. This is one of those kind of simple concepts that sounds a bit convoluted when typing it out like this, but let me continue explaining it. The opening cutscene sees Leon and Claire get separated by an explosion. The A scenario character will reach the RPD through the front door and be the first one to explore the place, while the B scenario character will then have to go in through the side because of this different starting point. The story plays out differently across the game's 4 campaigns, like how in Leon A, he reaches the STARS office before Claire and tells her that Chris isn't in town and gives her a radio so they can stay in touch. In Claire B, you just see this version of the story from Claire's perspective, but in Claire A, she went through the STARS office alone and doesn't run into Leon until the part where they both see Sherry on the west side of the RPD. The story is filled with changes that make it worth playing 4 times. For example, in the middle of Claire A, Sherry runs off without Claire, and in Leon B, we see Ada find Sherry, where she drops the pendant that she got from her mother, Annette, and Ada picks it up and wears it, which further provokes Annette when the two see each other later. But in the Leon A, Claire B story, this never happens. Another example is how in Leon A, Ada seemingly dies in a confrontation between Leon, Ada, and Annette Birkin, but in Leon B, Ada seemingly dies sacrificing herself for Leon against the Tyrant monster. In Claire A, Sherry gets infected with the G-Virus and Claire has to synthesize the vaccine for her, but asks Leon to grab Sherry from where Claire left her so they can meet up. Something you then do in Leon B. But in the Leon A, Claire B version of the story, this just never happens. My point is, the entire story is riddled with changes that you only see if you experience all 4 versions of its plot. But this also has an impact on the gameplay as well. In this room in the underground of the RPD, you'll find a locker with an item that expands your inventory by 2 slots, as well as a machine gun. I played Claire A first and took the expansion to my inventory and left the machine gun for Leon to find in Leon B. I accidentally forgot to go to this room during my Leon A playthrough, which meant that in Claire B I could take both the item expansion and the machine gun. There are other examples like this in the game where the choices of the A scenario affect the B scenario, and that's quite cool. So you want to play both A campaigns and both B campaigns to see all the differences, like how you explore different bits of level design in the B scenario and even fight different bosses, like how the first boss against William Birkin is something only the B character will have to do, and the same goes for the Tyrant at the end. I keep saying that there is reward in playing this game 4 times, and that's because I actually did do 4 playthroughs of this game, when in RE1 I only did 2 and then sampled some other versions of it. I played Claire A and Leon B on PlayStation, but then played Leon A and Claire B on Nintendo 64 because, like its predecessor, Resident Evil 2 was ported to several different platforms. There isn't much to say between these versions compared to RE1, so I won't spend as long on it, but I'll just say briefly that the PS1 version definitely is the most accessible version of the original RE2, being available on the PS3 store and all, but if you wanted to know how the other ports are, I will first say, hats off to the developers at Angel Studios who worked on porting RE2, this 2-disc PlayStation game, to the Nintendo 64. The N64 is certainly not a slouch of a console, it's just that the usage of cartridges is completely different from the PS1 CDs. But the game didn't compromise on any content. It has all the CG cutscenes and the audio that comes with it, just with very compressed quality.
It's over. No. I have to find my brother.
You're right. This is just the beginning. It's over.
No. I have to find my brother.
You're right. This is just the beginning.
Besides the AV aspect, it plays just as good on N64 as it did on PS1. The video output is not as sharp on N64 as it was on PS1, but that's to be expected across the board for the 2 consoles. So while not the best version of the game, the sheer amount of effort it took the dev team comprised of 9 people just to write the code it would take to port over and compress these PS1 assets onto the N64 in only 12 months is incredible. I'd try to explain it in more depth, but do I look like a programmer to you? RE1 was released on the Sega Saturn like we discussed last week, and the Saturn was supposed to get RE2. It even got featured in an issue of the Sega Saturn magazine, but the Saturn's hardware, the lack of its success in the Western market, and the upcoming release of the Sega Dreamcast made Capcom scrap the idea of an RE2 port on Saturn. But we did get full ports of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 on Dreamcast, as well as a new game, Code Veronica, that was temporarily exclusive to the Dreamcast. The port of RE2 on Dreamcast had features lifted from the PC version of the game, such as a gallery of art and FMVs, customizable button mapping, and the best quality backgrounds, as well as full-resolution FMVs, probably making it the highest quality version of the game to exist, even if it's pricey. RE2 and RE3 were also ported to the GameCube in the early 2000s, and these are pretty good ports too, having a higher resolution yet again, just without customizable button mapping. But they do have this feature where you can change the controls to where the R button moves you forward and how hard you press the button determines your speed, which I think is the most comfortable setup if you want to use the analog stick with this fixed camera angle tank-controlled game. And of course, I'd be a fool not to mention that RE2 also got a release on the Tiger Gamecom, but the only people who would ever take a Gamecom game seriously are the kind of dorks who want to rush into a conversation being all like, actually you can't say RE6 is the worst game of the series when it's clearly RE2 on Gamecom. Yeah, no shit. I obviously just don't take games of this tier very seriously. I mean, look at this garbage. But that's basically all I have to say on the various versions of this game. Before I went on this tangent about the ports, I was discussing the fact that RE2 had this A campaign, B campaign dynamic that was unique to RE2. However, this system also turned out to be one of the biggest disappointments from the RE2 remake. It turns out that the remake of the game was also experiencing some trouble when in development, much like the original. They really wanted to get ambitious with it at one point, but timing and budget got in the way, so things didn't pan out as planned. So some things made it in the game in a way that feels lame and last minute, but was due to the fact that the dev team was crunching all the way up until release in 2019. No bigger example than this alligator boss from the original game that the A campaign character had to kill that just got turned into an Uncharted chase scene out of nowhere in Leon's story from the remake. In RE2 Remake, the two campaigns feel much more like RE1, where the two stories don't feel like they were even meant to connect at all, as Leon and Claire explore the same areas in roughly the exact same time and somehow never see each other until the end of the game. The Tyrant also gets killed off in Claire's story, but keeps harassing Leon past that point. In the remake, you'll play the A story of either character and unlock the corresponding B story, but the difference basically amounts to the already underwhelming Streets opening being gone for the B character entirely, and the B character fighting the easiest boss in the game at the end and getting to see the actual ending of the story. If you look at RE2 Make from the perspective that the two stories weren't really meant to interact, but them doing so was something that got put in towards the end of development, it makes a lot more sense. But having said that, the B scenarios from the remake leave a lot to be desired given how the original game handled it so well. And it's not like there wasn't room for more to be done either. The remake had the chance to really improve on the ideas from the original, it's just a shame they didn't get the chance to do so. The story also feels much more fleshed out in the original game. I remember not having that much to say on the plot of RE2 Make when I reviewed it, and in hindsight, I feel like that's because there really isn't that much to say at all. Generally speaking, the remake keeps a lot of the details light in comparison to the original, and this is entirely speculation, but I think it was because of the fact that the remake of RE2 wasn't a direct sequel to any one game. It was a new game that happened to be based on one that already existed. It certainly wasn't a sequel to the remake of RE1 because that was released 17 years earlier with completely different gameplay, and while that game had a port on PS4 and Xbox One, it was not a contemporary game that you could just expect players to have already been familiar with like you could going into, say, RE8 after RE7. Here's what I mean. The original RE2 goes in much more depth through dialogue and hidden writings and what's actually going on in the story. Something they were able to get away with since this is a direct sequel to the hit game RE1, so people had gone into this one after having played that one. For example, it's made very clear that a few months ago, the STARS Alpha team explored the Spencer Mansion and found Umbrella's secret research lab and barely escaped with their lives. And now, a few months later, Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and Barry are working hard to expose Umbrella for what they've done, but are being held back because the chief of police is also working with Umbrella. In the remake, the events of RE1 are basically not mentioned. The T-virus that turned the Umbrella staff into the zombies we fought in RE1 has leaked into the city, which is why the town is overrun with zombies. However, the T-virus is also barely mentioned in RE2 Make. Instead, all the focus is on the G-virus, which was the source of conflict in the original game as well. The G-virus was developed by William and Annette Birkin, and when Umbrella's Secret Service came for the formula, William used it on himself to kill the whole squad so they couldn't get away with the T and G samples. The T samples getting into the water supply, which caused it to spread to the entire city. Most of the plot beats from the original RE2 are in the remake, it's just that, like I said, I feel the original game goes in more detail. In both the original and the remake, Sherry gets infected with the G-virus because William, as a G-mutant, needed to use his daughter as a way to further spread the G-parasite. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't actually think that was mentioned in the remake. Claire just finds Sherry sick and brings her to the lab to get the vaccine, when in the original game they explain what's going on much more. And like I mentioned, basically all the connections to RE1's story that RE2 had are not in the remake. Most noteworthy of all being Ada's character. In RE1, an Umbrella researcher named John left his notes behind in the lab under the mansion. He was seeing a woman named Ada, and I was thinking, there's no way that's the Ada from this game, right? And it turns out that it is. Ada's whole story in RE2 is trying to find John, learning that he was killed by Umbrella. Annette even mentioning to Ada that John made her name the password on his computer, something I thought was really goofy when you had to use that to get into his computer at the end of RE1, but I refrained from making a joke about it in the last video. The fact that such a minor thing was made into a major plot point in the sequel was pretty cool, and it not being in the remake is a bummer. The reveal that Ada was only with this John character as a way to get to Umbrella's secrets gets the audience more suspicious of Ada, leading to Leon learning that Ada is really a spy trying to get her hands on the G-virus sample and was just using him to help her with that. Compared to the remake where Ada claims to work for the FBI, which doesn't get challenged until the very end of the story. RE2 Make has a good and entertaining story, I just feel like its looser connection to RE1 means that a lot of interesting material is left on the cutting room floor. But I have been seemingly dogging on the remake for the last few minutes. I want to now flip things a bit and talk about what the remake does get right, after having played the original. While the PS1 RE2 is a more detailed version of the story, RE2 Make definitely presents what is there in a better way. I don't mean the cutscene animation, because that improvement is blatantly obvious. I just mean that RE2 Make has much less exposition than the original. This is one of the pros of some of the finer details getting left out. And for the exposition that is necessary, like Umbrella's task force coming for the G-Virus, you can find tapes on the bodies of these soldiers that you can then play at conveniently placed TVs with a VHS hooked up, and these will then show you what happened without a character outright telling you. The one flashback you do get with Annette before her death scene connects the dots in your mind with the tapes you may have seen earlier. In general, the remake just goes for a more character-focused story, getting the players invested in the emotions of the scenes as opposed to having large sums of intricate lore, and when playing it through after 4 playthroughs of the original, I still think it works. I still feel a sense of urgency when you have to rescue Sherry from Chief Irons in Claire's story, and that's because they wrote him to be the most despicable kind of person when he takes Sherry from Claire. You could already tell the guy was a freak in the original game, but his additional screen time as well as seeing how this guy talks to a child just reinforces the hate you'd have for him. That's not the only example, of course. I think Annette was a character that did a good job overhauling as well, making her more human as someone who created a terrible virus and feels conflicted between stopping William and saving Sherry. My point being, the additional character work in the remake does make up for what it lacks in terms of lore. The dialogue is also much more natural in the remake, allowing me to more easily get into the story and buy into the characters. I don't mean to rag on the dialogue and acting of RE2 original, because for its time I think the original did a pretty good job. The translation doesn't feel nearly as awkward as RE1, and the acting is leagues and bounds better than the first game. I wouldn't say the voice acting of RE2 is one for the ages, especially when the remake is so much better. However, I still think the original RE2 is a game you can play today, and yes, notice some weird lines in delivery from time to time, but overall not think too much about it since it's pretty decent across the board and was quite good for its time. While I was on the subject of things RE2 Make did that I preferred over the original, that now leads to a discussion to RE2 Make's gameplay compared to the original. Like I said before, if you want a whole review on the mechanics of RE2 Make, my video from last year will certainly suffice. I just wanted to focus on some of the things that I thought about as a result of playing the original. In Leon's playthrough, there's a part where you have to take control of Ada to progress after Leon takes a bullet for her. And in Claire's story, there's a part where you have to play as Sherry to progress. In the original is because she wandered off on her own, and in the remake is because she got captured by Chief Irons. When reviewing RE2 Make, I said these segments kind of killed the pace, because Ada's is pretty easy to get through and is therefore boring by comparison to the main game, and because Sherry's is so scripted that once you've seen it a few times it tends to lose a lot of luster. But the segments with Ada and Sherry, especially in the PS1 game, made me appreciate what was done with it in the remake more than I did before. The original just doesn't do much with these two besides running into one room, solving one puzzle that Ada and Sherry both have to do, and then running back to switch to the main character. But then you play as them again later at the start of the sewers segment, where you do very little besides run through a couple rooms. Narratively, separating Ada and Sherry from Leon and Claire serves a purpose, as Ada confronts Annette, and with Leon not present for it, he's still in the dark about Ada's motives. And for Sherry, getting her away from Claire gives William the chance to infect her with the G-Virus. However, that's basically it. Now, what I said about the remake segments with these two still stands. However, I think the devs reworking these moments into something more memorable is commendable. I actively remember Ada having to hack into this door before the tyrant catches up to her, or the tension in the first playthrough hoping Chief Irons wouldn't find Sherry in the part where you have to hide from him. Plus, the harder difficulties add much more tension with the fear of losing progress, and believe me, I'd know. The things I prefer about the RE2 remake don't stop there, though. In the original game, once the player regains control of Leon and Claire for good, I thought the later areas weren't that impressive. I felt that the underground and the lab in RE1 were a big downgrade from the mansion and the guardhouse in that very game, and RE2 didn't really fix that problem. The sewers is especially bland, as all you need to do to escape is just find 2 medallions that go in a slot that open the path to the next area, and there isn't much to it besides that. Then you take a train car down to Umbrella's secret lab, an area dripping with atmosphere, but it also doesn't have that much going on. On the first playthrough, I got kind of tripped up with what was needed in what room, like finding this computer login on the top floor and then needing to use that in this nest on the bottom floor, or how you're supposed to synthesize the vaccine for Sherry when playing as Claire, but once you do get to grips with it, there's not that much to say about this ending portion as far as exploration and level design is concerned. I do like that they keep introducing new enemies like these plant guys or the evolved liquors from the start. The remake just kept reusing the liquor from the beginning of the game, so I'll give credit to that, but the remake really outshined the original here in terms of level design. First, the game opens with a relatively faithful new version of the RPD, where I think the designers worked in ways to make the RPD more puzzle-focused than the original RPD, like finding the 3 medallions to get to the basement or doing these mini-puzzles to gain access to more stuff in the safety deposit room. But once you escape the RPD, the game keeps the hits coming. The sewers and the lab, now called the Nest, were completely done over from scratch. On the one hand, trying to improve what was there makes sense to me, but on the other hand, I just think what we got was way better than what was in the original. You really need to explore the different areas of the sewer to find these chest keys that you need to use to solve a big puzzle to get into the waste disposal. And in the nest, you have to gather the equipment needed to grab this keycard that will allow you to reach the other side of the lab where the boss fight is. I think the later areas of RE2 Make lack the scare factor of the RPD, but the design holds up really well in that game from top to bottom. The remake is also home to a more badass version of the Tyrant, a giant monster that chases you throughout the RPD. I detailed this in my remake review. This guy is one of the most memorable enemies I've ever seen in a game. I am biased a bit here because RE2 Make was my first proper horror game, but on that first playthrough, nothing was more menacing than the Tyrant, aka Mr. X's footprints stomping towards me. It created tense situations like him chasing me in a room with lickers, so you have to risk either going too slow and allowing him to catch up, or going really fast and attracting the attention of the lickers. In the original game, the Tyrant will bug the B-scenario character, but I must say, I was surprised at how lame he was in this game. He almost always got one punch in on me, but then he would do this long ground pound animation which gave me the perfect chance to escape. But then you'd never see him again for another 45 minutes or so of gameplay. The remake really touched that one up. Same for the bosses for that matter. The remake bosses test your ammo management, your aiming ability, and your timing, leading to encounters that were very memorable. RE2 has some really easy boss fights where you have to shoot your most powerful weapons, and you try to get some distance, and then you keep shooting your most powerful weapons at whatever it is, and then that would be it. This being a game-wide thing. Kinda stealing away the moment from what should be cool encounters like the Birkin bosses. Although it's still super satisfying to get that final hit in on the Tyrant with your rocket launcher. Despite my nitpicks with the final level, I still think the climax of the original RE2 is pretty well done. You have to escape the lab before it self-destructs, like RE1, but now you actually have a ticking clock to worry about. When I did my Leon B run, I kept having to run back and forth to the item box to make space for these cables you need, and because of that, I almost ran out of time. I literally beat the game with 5 seconds left on the clock, so that was pretty tense. I also like how the story ends, in particular Leon B. The characters may have survived this nightmare, however the story is only just beginning. I mean, Claire has yet to find Chris, and Umbrella's experiments just caused an entire city to become a zombie-infested ghost town. You better believe there's room for even more exciting sequels after this. Leon B ending with an iconic final line / sequel hook as the composers then go nuts with the guitar and the drums in the credits.
Hey, it's up to us to take out Umbrella.
And that's Resident Evil 2, folks. This review of Resident Evil 2 kind of turned into an original versus remake video halfway through, but I think I should make it clear that regardless of whichever one I enjoyed more, it definitely does not take away from either one. Starting with the original, I thought that the game wasn't firing on all cylinders with the level design, especially when comparing the RPD to the RE1 mansion, and when comparing RE2's later levels with the RPD. But let's not lose the plot here. RE2 is a great game. I'm so glad I finally got the chance to play it, as I was, despite the nitpicks, engaged with it from start to finish in all 4 of my playthroughs. It's an all-time classic and it definitely is worthy of the hype. I can easily see myself revisiting this one in the future to unlock all the secrets and get the highest ranks. But compared to the remake, I just don't like it as much because from a gameplay perspective, RE2 Make is still one of my absolute favorite games of all time, and from those lofty heights, I didn't really expect RE2 to compare, but the fact that I enjoyed it as much as I did is definitely worth something. If I were to score the RE games I have reviewed, RE3 Make is a C, RE1 was a B or a B+, RE2 would then get an A. It just so happens that RE2 Make is an S tier game. So yeah, compared to what I view as perfection, a great game isn't as good, but it's still a great time. And hell, it does have the more in-depth story over the remake. So don't count this one out, I think both are worth your time. Capcom already knew that Resident Evil was a cash cow, having made multiple versions of RE1 and RE2, but they had no intentions of slowing the train down now. Going forward, RE was a series they intended to put a lot into with spin-off games in development alongside multiple main series entries. One of these new main games came to be known as Resident Evil Code Veronica. However, this game was going to be exclusive for the Sega Dreamcast, and we'll cover that in the next video. The other game was in development for the PlayStation 1, but reportedly wouldn't be done before the release of the PlayStation 2, so it was scrapped and the team behind it was set to work on Resident Evil 4 for the next generation of consoles. Now, how that story unfolded is best saved for another video. Capcom wanted to round out the RE series on PS1, so they took one of the side games that they were developing where you'd have to play as a new character surviving the nightmare in Raccoon City first seen in Resident Evil 2, and reworked that idea to star Jill Valentine from RE1 as she tries to escape Raccoon City while being pursued by Umbrella's Nemesis monster, and from there, the game known as Resident Evil 3, Nemesis, was born. going into this game blind was an interesting case for me because I barely knew anything about the original RE3 from 1999 before actually playing it. Might sound weird considering that last year I did a review on Resident Evil 3 from 2020. RE3 got remade for PS4, Xbox One, and PC, however that game, which I obviously have played, received a lot of flack from fans due to it not being a faithful remake of the PS1 classic, and just not really being a standout game on its own. For the video I did last year, I chose to focus on how RE3 Make was a letdown as a sequel to RE2 Make, which was one of my favorite games of all time and still is. So going into the original RE2, I was curious to see how I'd feel about the game that inspired one of my favorites, but for this, I was basically playing a game I just have no experience with or knowledge of outside of basic plot details, and then I'll be able to join the discourse on how RE3 Make compares to the original. Like last time, for my actual thoughts on how RE3 Make handles as a game on its own, you can check out my original video. I'll be bringing it up mostly out of comparison to the original today. So circling back to what the video is about, how did I feel about RE3? Fans in my comment section seem to really enjoy it and hold it up as one of the best in the series, so I was hoping I'd feel much the same. In addition to that, how do I feel about the 2020 remake after having played the original? Well, let's begin and find out. Going off of its development history, I always categorized RE3 as a glorified side game, like RE 2.5 more than an actual new game. So actually playing it revealed a lot about how wrong I was, because Resident Evil 3 adds quite a lot of improvements to the presentation and to the gameplay. In the former category, the character models have been improved with each game. In RE1, you could sort of make out details in the characters' faces, but on the whole, the models look like a blob of pixels. RE2 made improvements in that each character had a more visible face. RE3 is the best the series has seen thus far in that the models looked much cleaner. The arms, for example, looked like arms and not individual pieces put together like in the previous games. It's also really nice how RE3 keeps the pace up by allowing you to skip cutscenes with the press of the select button. Not being able to skip cutscenes in a game like RE dampens the replay value, so skipping cutscenes is a feature I greatly appreciated on my second playthrough of RE3. But now we get to the gameplay enhancements. First, running upstairs in this game functions like how you'd expect playing a modern game. You move the character up the stairs by pressing the D-pad up. In RE1 and RE2, you'd have to press the interact button to see the previous player characters just go up the stairs automatically. This doesn't sound like a big change, however, it does keep the flow of the gameplay up as you don't have to come to a stop before going up or down a flight of stairs. You can just run up or down them, assuming they're in the currently loaded area. It also allows enemies to follow you up and down stairs, so stairs don't provide you any relief they might have in a previous game. Next, RE3 introduces some mainstays for the series. When you open your inventory at the start of the game, you'll see 2 books that explain the game's mechanics in depth. One of your starting items is this reloading tool. Throughout the game, you'll find various types of gunpowder, and you can then use them with the reloading tool to get more ammo for your weapons. Mixing and matching different gunpowder types produces ammo for your different weapons, although I usually just combine Type A's together to get a crap ton of handgun bullets, and then did the same for the Type B's I found to get a ton of shotgun shells. Later games would remove the reloading tool part of it though, which I think makes sense. It's a middleman you probably need a trip to the item box for anyway. In later entries, such as the remake of Resident Evil 3, it's changed where you just combine the different types of gunpowder and the result is more ammo for your weapons, while still giving you the customization that the original RE3 provided. RE1 and RE2 already had a system where you could mix and match the different herbs to generate different effects in your health bar, so it's only natural to introduce a system like that for your ammunition. When actually controlling your character, RE3 makes a critical improvement. By pressing down and the run button, Jill and newcomer Carlos will do a 180-degree turn, allowing you to quickly move in the opposite direction from where you were facing. This is one of the biggest issues I had with playing as the characters in RE1 and 2, something I even mentioned in the RE1 video. Slowly backing up and manually facing the character in the other direction, or trying to do a really wide turn made me feel like the higher power enemies like the hunters or the lickers just had more mobility than I did. Wasn't a big deal, it was just something that created a learning curve when trying to play RE1 and 2 for the first time. The quick turn being something that still appeared in all the games going forward because it's a great addition to the player's moveset. Especially useful in a game like RE3 because of the fact that the game has a plentiful amount of tight corridors for its level design. So RE3 is without a doubt a full sequel to RE2, not a glorified side game like I was expecting, as it adds crucial mechanics and improvements to the formula that would still be in effect for all the coming games. An important part of the series' evolution from a gameplay perspective. Now, I want to say all the new mechanics and features of RE3 are a hit, but that wouldn't be accurate. RE3 also introduced a thing called the emergency dodge, where if an enemy is about to attack you, pressing the R1 button will cause Jill or Carlos to dodge out of the way. R1 is also the aim button, so when your gun is drawn, you have to press the shoot button to do this. On paper, I like it. A frame-perfect dodge mechanic is right up my alley. However, I feel like the dodge in RE3 is trash. With enemies like the basic zombie, it's not very clear when you're supposed to press the dodge button when it's attacking. That is a simple matter of trial and error though. If they wanted a frame-perfect mechanic that only advanced players would get to grips with, that's fine. I mean, Devil May Cry is my favorite game series. Obviously, I'm down with the idea. But in RE3, there are numerous examples I recall where I would dodge an attack, but while in the recovery frames from said dodge, the attack I dodged would still be active and then I just get hit by that attack. That should just not be allowed. If a game has a frame-perfect dodge mechanic you have to learn the timing for, you should be rewarded for that by granting like several frames of invincibility. As is, the dodge still allowing me to take damage is my biggest issue with how RE3 plays. It was the leading cause of frustration on my second playthrough of the game. By contrast, the remake really improved this part of it. Jill has a dedicated dodge move in the remake, one you can use to get away from the enemies, even if they aren't near you, which comes in handy when you're low on health and want to quickly get away from the zombie hordes. If you use the right timing with it, then you'll dodge the enemy's attack and time will slow down, allowing you to get hits in with whatever weapons you have equipped. That's a simple change and I'm a big fan of it. It fixes my issue with the old dodging completely. It still takes skill and timing to use, and so you get rewarded for pulling it off. It's especially satisfying as Carlos as you just punch enemies right in the face and send them flying backwards. But I'll say this, I grew to really hate the enemies in relation to the camera in the remake. There were several instances where I'd be fighting with an enemy and then get attacked, or worse, killed by an enemy I couldn't see that was right behind me. Yeah, what an idiot I am for my inability to predict that. Although, while we're comparing the original to the remake, best to talk about the level design. Here is where the remake falls considerably short. This is already where it fell short compared to RE2's remake, which has some of the best level design I've experienced in the series thus far. But I'll say again, I was expecting RE3 to be a smaller game than previous ones. The remake feeling really short certainly didn't help with that, but I was very surprised. RE3 is a big game. Maybe the biggest in the series thus far. RE3 only features one campaign, where you start off as Jill and play as Carlos for a brief bit later in the game, when RE1 and 2 had 2 campaigns each to experience. Well, you could say RE2 had 4, but you know what I mean. RE3 made up for its lack of a second campaign by having the longest singular campaign in the series so far. It took me about 6.5 hours to get through my first ever run of RE1, and about 5 hours to get through my first campaign in RE2. It took me over 10 hours to get through RE3 the first time. This game achieves that through 2 methods. The first is that from a pure content perspective, RE3's campaign just has the most in it. In RE2, I said that the later levels were a little short and linear compared to the RPD, which in and of itself wasn't as complex from the mansion from RE1. So from that pure content perspective, RE2 lacked a bit, but it greatly made up for it in all other aspects of its design. RE1 also had lackluster final areas, but the opening few were so great that it didn't really matter. Here in RE3, I would say that the areas you play still have that RE2 thing going on where none of them are super large and complex, however it just has more of them. In RE1, we had the mansion, the guardhouse, the mansion continued, which probably doesn't count as a new area, but there's enough new that I figured I'd include it, the underground, and the lab. In RE2, you had the RPD, the sewers, and another lab that RE2 make named the Nest. In RE3, you explore the streets of Raccoon City, the RPD, the streets continued, the clock tower, the hospital, the park, and the dead factory. So yeah, on its own, the park isn't a super long segment of gameplay, but RE3 uses this longer list of levels to provide the best of the RE formula in quick bursts. You get to the clock tower, for example, and do what you've come to expect. Explore around, find areas you can and cannot go, and look around for items that allow you into the areas you couldn't get to before, which house puzzles that you solve for more items that further your ability to get through the location. I'm a broken record at this point, but that basic design from RE1 just still holds up and provides entertainment in every game. So yeah, RE3's areas might not be Spencer Mansion tier on their own, but it has a consistent set of levels that keep the variety up with the different visuals and puzzle gimmicks while maintaining the exploration value I love about these games from top to bottom. The level design is where RE3 Make fails the most. Here you have the Raccoon City streets, the sewers, the RPD as Carlos, the hospital as Carlos, and finally another underground lab. After having played both games, I really do believe the pros of RE2 Make outweigh the issues that arise from it having cut content from the original game, like the alligator boss. But after having played both of these, I think RE3 Make goes too far. For starters, as a level, the city streets are nothing like the original. It's a tiny hub area where you, yes, do have to explore to find things to progress. RE3 Make doesn't fail at that, it just provides it in the most limited capacity I have seen in the series thus far. Raccoon City in the remake is a main hub area with a couple of different sides to explore. One of them being this new area with these spider monsters that I didn't even enjoy playing because the enemies poison you, making you really slow until you heal. It also only lasts like 6 minutes if you know what you're doing, so there's that too. In the original game, Raccoon City was huge. You had to explore the entire uptown and downtown, going into various buildings like the bar, a restaurant, the news building, the gas station, and so on. At least RE3 Remake had bad box art Mega Man at the toy store. There was that. But moving on from that, the fact that major areas from the original RE3 aren't in the remake becomes a problem because what's there instead isn't great. You have to play another sewers level, which isn't as complex or interesting as the one from RE2 Make, and at the end of the game you have to play another lab, which isn't as good as the one from RE2 Make. I think this problem was born from the fact that the RE3 remake was released just a little over a year after the Resident Evil 2 remake. I don't know when this game started development, but on the whole, it seems pretty rushed, so they just couldn't make new areas. They instead reused settings from Remake 2. It's so shameless that the lab at the end is literally called The Nest 2. The issue isn't that these new areas are atrocious. Like I said, they still have what I want in an RE game from a level design perspective, it's just that areas being so similar to what was in RE2 Make draws comparison to that game, and since it's not a fraction as good, it sits in the shadow of that game. But then, by not including key areas from the original RE3, it just doesn't hold up as a great remake of that game. It's just a shame, as I'm sure with more dev time, more areas would have been included, and with that, RE3 Remake would be able to stand on its own 2 feet much more than it does today. Credit where credit is due though. I thought the hospital level was good. I think the original was decent, but the puzzles were really simple. For example, you needed a voice sample to get on the elevator, and the tape of the guy's voice is on the desk right next to the door. But the remake forces you to look around for that tape on the upper floors to use on the door on the first floor. Then, once Carlos's portion is done, you can go back through it as Jill to find some extra upgrades for the endgame. So like I said, this was a good level. Can't take that away from Remake 3. About 1,000 words ago, I was saying that RE3 managed to be the longest game in the series so far in 2 ways. The first was the sheer level count, but the second was because RE3 is the hardest game in the PS1 trilogy. I am fully willing to admit this. I got my ass royally handed to me while playing RE3. Genuinely, I sucked at this game. The game floods the areas with zombies you have to face off against, and so contending with that always drains my health bar, and then the bosses just wrecked me. Whether it be this giant worm boss, or the various fights with Nemesis, or whatever, I just died over and over and over again. I think the reason for this is that in my first run of the game, I had played it like RE2. In the last video, I had mentioned that in Resident Evil 2, there were almost no challenging boss fights in the entire game as you stood around wailing on bosses with your most powerful weapons. In RE3, it's just not like that. If you try to use this strategy while battling the worm boss, you'll take a crap ton of damage and die. If you just grab your most powerful weapons and blast Nemesis with them, the reload times will probably get you damaged and most likely killed. I was literally on this courtyard Nemesis fight for upwards of, maybe even longer than an hour. Now, it's entirely possible that if I reviewed this game blind, say, 5 years ago, my line of thinking would stop there and I just list all the various ways the game beat the stuffing out of me. That's our obligatory Sly reference for today. And yeah, my deaths at the hands of the dodge mechanic and my time spent on that courtyard boss were certainly not something I was especially happy about, but there was one prevailing feeling throughout the entire first playthrough I did on RE3. I sucked at this game. I could tell RE3 was a good game, I just didn't understand it. I tried brute forcing it, a strategy that worked pretty well in RE2. The game I would argue is the easiest of the trilogy. But that just wasn't going to happen in RE3, so you either adapt to the challenge of the game or get killed repeatedly. Like this part where you need to get back to the train to get to the clock tower. Nemesis was guarding the entrance, but with my being in the danger state, my getting past him was a nigh impossibility. But I kept trying over and over again, even with it being a lost cause. I was pretty sure I used all the health there was in the streets, so what now? Am I screwed? Well, no, I backtracked to the RPD to grab this first aid spray I left behind before, slowly limping my way there. All in all, I wasted like over 30 minutes here. I'm just entirely able to admit, on my first run of this game, I just sucked at it. Something the game agreed with when I got a well-deserved E rank at the end of the game. You could say that was because I picked hard mode at the start, but I mean, it was either that or easy mode, which overloads the player with healing items and ammo, so that wasn't gonna happen. For this game, I knew it was more important than ever to play it a second time. I mean, if I reviewed Mega Man X3 or Mega Man X4 after my first runs of those games, it would be a much different story from what you see today. I already played the other games more than once, so I was gonna do it for RE3 no matter what. However, I just thought it was really important for me to play RE3 a second time, knowing what to expect and seeing how my experience changed. And my suspicions were confirmed. I had a much smoother time with RE3 the second go around and can easily tell you the game is really damn good. When I know that there are several segments of the game that would trip me up, I made sure to hoard as many healing items as humanly possible and then spent them all on the courtyard boss fight. But then later bosses like the worm really aren't that difficult anyway. When I first played RE3, I was able to get into the exploration and the puzzles, but just got utterly destroyed by the enemies and bosses. The second time, I was prepared and barely ever died throughout that playthrough, even if the game thought I sucked enough to get a D. But hey, it's a higher grade, right? Although, while on the subject of playing the game a second time, this one creates replay value in numerous ways. On my first playthrough, I died in the hospital and had to play it again, but was really thrown off by the fact that the solution to this moving shelf puzzle was different from before. My first thought is, maybe I'm just remembering it wrong. But I was not. Entire puzzle solutions are changed up whenever you encounter them, whether that be from death or a new run. This keeps things interesting as you still have to work to solve the puzzles on your first few playthroughs of the game, instead of just rushing through them since you already know the solution. But while I'm talking about the replayability of RE3, I'd be a fool not to mention the Nemesis choice system. At several points of RE3, you'll have to make a choice between one of two things. When Nemesis first appears, you have to decide if you're going to try and fight him or if you're going to run inside the RPD. In many cases, picking the more difficult option will net you an advantage. For example, blowing Nemesis up in the restaurant or shocking him at the clock tower will net you items like a super powerful handgun. Now, I believe he drops more items if you keep beating him in the regular gameplay, but do I look like I have those skills at the current moment in time? The first Nemesis appearance is a great example of providing an advantage. Nemesis just killed Brad in this scene, and if you grab his STARS card, you can use it on the computer by the entrance of the RPD, which tells you the passcode for the locker the STARS office key is being held in. If you didn't grab Brad's card, you'd have to further traverse the RPD to find Jill's card and then run back to the computer. It's more daunting to try and survive Nemesis at this point in the game, but the reward is a run with a little less backtracking. The factory is an interesting case because if you choose to push Nemesis off the bridge, Jill will enter the factory from the door, but if you just dive off the bridge yourself, you get in through the underground portion. Because of these choices, the story will play out in different ways, like how on my first playthrough, Jill had to shoot Nikolai out of the sky and escape on a chopper alongside Carlos and Barry from the first game. But then in my second, Nikolai just gets killed by Nemesis earlier in the level, and then Jill and Carlos can escape without needing Barry to rescue them. What better reward for replaying a game is there than these tiny story changes? You might then wonder, how does the remake handle this? Haven't talked about that game in a few minutes. The answer is that RE3 Remake doesn't even have the Nemesis choices in it at all. Another point of replayability zapped away from the remake completely. On that note, Nemesis was terrible in the remake across the board. The original Nemesis was a really cool enemy, taking what had been done with the Tyrant in RE2 and massively improving it. Nemesis has been programmed by Umbrella to hunt down all the members of STARS, as it was established in RE2 that the surviving STARS members are trying to reveal what Umbrella had done after RE1. Nemesis successfully kills Brad and then goes after Jill with nothing held back. Nemesis adds a lot of tension to RE3 as he sprints at you full speed and you feel like a real pro gamer if you escape without taking damage. But then you know he's still out there and could strike at any moment, so the relief is temporary. Especially because the game plays this ominous music whenever Nemesis is nearby and ready to attack, but just hasn't started yet. He could literally be anywhere. It's great for keeping the player's stress up. In the remake, I'm assuming the devs saw how much people loved Mr. X in the RE2 remake and wanted to recreate that effect, since the expectations would naturally be high given that they're remaking RE3. But, like I said, it's awful. Remake Nemesis is comedically not threatening. Like when you go into the toy store, he'll just stand there waiting for you, not bust through the wall like he's obviously capable of doing otherwise. He just keeps standing there. It's hilarious. Or how taking him down is as simple as one grenade. One grenade! That's so lame. The parts where he actually chases you are in short supply compared to both the original Nemesis and Mr. X from RE2 make, so he doesn't even provide that tension he did in the original. Instead, they just use Nemesis as a way to load the game up with RE4-esque action scenes, which isn't the end of the world, but if things like this are what defines Nemesis instead of the thing he actually did in the original, it's just a downgrade. No better comparison than the intro of Nemesis in both games. On PS1, Brad tells Jill that someone's after STARS, but you don't know what, and then later Nemesis just drops in and murders Brad right before your very eyes, showing you what you're up against, and then the gameplay does not disappoint. In the remake, the very first thing that happens after this out-of-place first-person walking segment is Nemesis bursting through the wall, which leads to an Uncharted escape scene where the entire apartment building goes up in flames. But if we're talking about the story, I won't rag on RE3 Remake completely. In RE2, I was really surprised to see just how in-depth I thought the plot was in the original game since the remake left out so many of the finer details. By comparison, I think RE3 Remake did a good job adapting the plot of the game, which is impressive given the fact that so many of the original game's stages were cut. But I will begin by saying that I think the original RE3 sold me on the weight of its story much more. RE3's plot actually begins shortly before the events of RE2. When Leon and Claire arrive in town, the city's already dead and overrun with zombies. RE3 begins with the zombie takeover just beginning. In fact, the opening cutscene just drops you right into the action, as we see the cops and the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service trying to hold the line against the zombies, but most of them dying. I'm sure this has been seen in a gazillion zombie movies, however I was pretty into it with RE3. If you've been playing the series since RE1, you know what Umbrella's virus is capable of, especially after RE2, but to then get into RE3 and actually see the city as it's falling apart and explore the areas that were once normal that are now on fire or filled with zombies sold me on how much of a disaster this situation is, especially with this somber, desolate music they play at the beginning of the game. Halfway through the game, there's a time skip to after the events of RE2 have taken place as Raccoon City is on its last legs, completely overrun beyond repair, making you wonder, how is this game gonna end? The answer is that the government fires a nuclear missile that wipes Raccoon City off the face of the earth, actually showing you the city being reduced to atoms, followed by a broadcast saying that the casualties are in the hundreds of thousands. All that's in the remake. I just think the original game makes the gradual fall of Raccoon City a little more impactful as the culmination of everything you've seen in the trilogy thus far, and that's because you actually explore Raccoon City much more in the original than you do in the remake. But like RE2 make, I do think RE3's remake succeeds at the characterization. For example, Jill not trusting Carlos because of his being with Umbrella is a passing footnote in the original, but in the remake it's a relationship that fully develops throughout the game as Carlos shows through action that he's only here to help people. Carlos says in the PS1 game that he's just the hired gun, but in the remake he has no idea that Umbrella's evil and discovers that for himself throughout the story. Being a character I really enjoyed all the screen time of as a comedic but reliable side character. Background characters also get a lot more screen time here too, like Tyrell, who's killed by Nikolai in the original game but doesn't do anything outside of that. But in the remake, he's trying to help Jill and Carlos, and when he dies, you feel that extra bit of urgency to get the vaccine for the T-virus so they can stop the city from being nuked, which is a plot point they use to make the villain, Nikolai, even more despicable than he was in the original. In the old RE3, he was pretty bad, knowing from the start that the city was lost, but Umbrella just wanted to see how the T-virus fared in live military combat, so he's being paid to collect that data. He's just out to make bank. But in the remake, he gets every chance under the sun to show how he's the most cocky kind of pure evil, even destroying the vaccine, dooming Raccoon City. So all in all, it's just like RE2 where I really got into the story and characters of the remake, but I think the original has more impact with its plot points. But I don't feel like you miss a lot going off of the remake alone this time. Hell, there's even a piece of writing that explains the events of RE1, and that it's the T-virus taking over the city, which RE2 make didn't really clarify. The only thing about the remake story I thought didn't work was just the way it opened and ended. I mentioned how good the opening cutscene of the original game is, and then the remake just opens up with this assortment of real-life footage that has nothing to do with a zombie takeover, followed by some Umbrella propaganda, when the original game's opening just got you into the action much more effectively. The city still got nuked at the end, but I feel the ending is more abrupt. We don't see the damage report or these character epilogues that the original game had, which shows the status of every major character in the series so far. It allowed the game to feel more satisfying as the end of the Raccoon City trilogy, if that's what you want to call it. Past that, I don't have too much else to add on RE3 as a game. I pretty much said my piece in the level design of RE3 and RE3 Remake earlier, so talking about the final levels at this point would be a bit redundant. Though, as an aside, I don't know if I just didn't know the master strategy for this boss with Nemesis and the acid, but I thought it was pretty annoying at first. You need to shoot the levers to activate the acid that tears the monster apart, but auto-aim just kept targeting Nemesis, and when I'd start to turn and get hit and have to start over. It wasn't until I changed the controls to manual aiming when I could deal with this one really easily. Is that what everyone else does, or is there a strategy I missed? Lastly, the remake had another missed opportunity at the end. The final Nemesis choice gives you the ability to kill the thing once and for all, and after a whole game of him hunting down the STARS members, Jill goes,
"You want stars? I'll give you stars."
The remake just tosses that line in 1/3 of the way through the game when there was this perfect moment for it at this monstrosity of a final boss. But like I said, that's basically all I've got for RE3. This was the game where I had to process my thoughts on it the most after I played it twice, and in conclusion, I think RE3 is pretty good. The main thing that keeps me thinking it is that way is because of the well-designed levels and exploration. I just can't get enough of that from the classic-styled RE games. It's just that RE3 tries to sprinkle more action into the game, and I just don't think the controls were really there to make it a super fun action game. I guess you could say RE2 tried the same thing, but I think that game had more action spectacle rather than the encounters RE3 tries going for. RE2's combat still isn't trying to be that dynamic at the end of the day, which I was perfectly fine with. I got my ass kicked by RE3 that first time, and I won't deny it. I sucked at this game, and that's why I'm glad I gave it a second playthrough to really make sure. RE3 is a strong game, just with a bit of a learning curve, and that goes for a large portion of my favorite games, so I can't be one to judge RE3 for a rockier first playthrough. Hell, I might even like it more than I already do when I replay it again, which I would certainly have no complaints about doing. I still like the original RE2 more though. That was definitely my favorite of the PS1 trilogy. RE1 and 3 are pretty much tied though, so there's that. Together, the trilogy is just such an iconic part of the PS1 era, and I couldn't be happier now that I finally played the games for myself and given them these videos that I'm really proud of. As for the remake, that's a game that comments have continuously told me is really bad, and after having done my third playthrough, I guess I still don't see it. I just think RE3 Remake is too inoffensive to be some piece of shit, you know? I think it speaks well of the RE series. Of the main games, there really hasn't been some pile of glitchy garbage in the roster, or at least, to my knowledge, there hasn't been one. So a game like RE3 Remake just looks poor by comparison to the heights the main series had seen otherwise. But this is also not a ringing endorsement of RE3 2020 either. The game is ultimately okay. Inoffensive is the word I used before, and I'm gonna stick to it. If you play it, you will have played a decent game, just one that isn't really special or interesting. One that fails to be a captivating sequel to the legendary RE2 remake, and also a game that isn't a good remake on its own. It's okay, there are things I like about it mechanically and from a story perspective, but it just averages out to alright. This was my third playthrough and it's probably my last. Whereas with the original, I'm definitely going to keep playing it after the video is done. But on that note, next time we're covering the Sega Dreamcast title, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Lots of people love this game, and the critics felt that way when the game first released. Code Veronica debuted in the Sega Dreamcast in early 2000, just a few months after the release of Resident Evil 3 on PlayStation. If you've been following these videos so far, you know that RE1 dropped on the Sega Saturn in 1997, but in the process of making a port for RE2 on that console, they quickly realized it wasn't working and that it wasn't worth doing since the Saturn was basically dead in the West by 1998. So they got to work on making a new Resident Evil title that would be exclusive to Sega's next console, the Dreamcast. Like I was saying last week, Capcom clearly had a lot of faith in Resident Evil as a series by this point with 2 hit games under its belt. So numerous games were in development at this time, a side game being expanded into the full RE3 like I explained in the previous video, with the Sega project coming to fruition as Resident Evil Code Veronica. When it was released, Code Veronica sold less than the PS1 trilogy did, despite being one of the best-selling games on the console. However, that was to be expected given the fact that the PlayStation was a commercial juggernaut, and the Dreamcast, like the Saturn before it, was clearly not going anywhere good by 2000. Especially with the PS2 on the way to put the last nail in Sega's console coffin. What Code Veronica was met with was glowing praise from the critics, especially in regards to its visual presentation, demonstrating just how much the Dreamcast was capable of compared to the previous gen tech. This positive reception remained consistent when the game was re-released on the PlayStation 2 in 2001 as Resident Evil Code Veronica X, but got more mixed reviews when Code Veronica X then released on the GameCube in 2003, and much more negative when the game was remastered on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2011. Needless to say, my claim that this was a mixed reception entry was a vast oversimplification of the matter. Regardless of all that, I went into this with an open mind. The whole point of this retrospective is my finally playing these games that I've always wanted to get into for a long time now, but just never had the time, despite loving the output I had gotten the chance to play. So it doesn't really matter what I thought people thought of each game, you know? I'm just here to say what I thought. I wanted to like Code Veronica since I really dug the PS1 trilogy, but you've read the title of the video. I didn't really like Code Veronica, and that makes me very sad to say. I don't think Code Veronica is some pile of crap, I just didn't have that much fun playing it either. And that's the thing that makes me sad about it. So many evidently enjoy it, and I wanted to be one of those people, but I just wasn't. It doesn't bring me joy to say this about Code Veronica either. When it comes to negative reviews, a game has to really be an E-tier experience for me to want to rip into it. These days, I try to make more of a comedy theater out of it, like in the new X7 video from a couple weeks back. Code Veronica isn't that kind of game. I just played it 1.5 times and just didn't like it that much, which I guess warrants the conversation of how I played it. For my first run of Code Veronica, I just played it on the Dreamcast. For my second run, I played Code Veronica X on the PlayStation 2. As mentioned before, it was also on the GameCube, and even had higher quality textures compared to the PS2 release, as you might expect. Code Veronica X adds a few extra cutscenes that makes the story feel more fleshed out, something we can talk about more later, and makes some graphical changes like Steve's hair, but otherwise it's basically the same game as it was on the Dreamcast. The PlayStation 2 version added motion blur to the game, a possible way to obscure the game's 480i resolution, not sure. The HD edition of CVX was a weird one though. First, I think it looks atrocious. I'm not usually the kind of person who finds a remaster the best version of a game, and CVX is a casual example of why. It utilizes entirely different lighting from the Dreamcast version, and so the whole game just looks really oversaturated, and I find that incredibly distracting. Especially when the pre-rendered cutscenes still look like the original game because they're pre-rendered. It's not broken or anything like a really bad remaster would be, however, I just find the phenomenon of remasters completely overhauling the visuals of a game into some bloomified, high contrast, or oversaturated mess to be a practice that needs to end. But most remasters don't get much time and budget, so what can you really expect? The other odd thing about CVX HD is that it's not very accessible. If you want to play it, your only options are the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Xbox One, and the Xbox Series consoles. And that's how I played it for the limited amount of playtime I put into it. Capcom remastered all the 2000s RE games on PS3 and 360, but for some reason you can't get CVX on the newer PlayStation consoles or Steam, when you can for the other 6th-gen RE remasters. Don't be fooled. The version of CVX on PS4 is an emulation of the PS2 release, not the HD edition, before anyone says it. Just an odd thing, not sure why they did it like that. But anyway, even if the visual problem wasn't there, I also hate the button mapping of CVX HD. The Dreamcast version had the bottom face button interact with things and the left one shoot, a reverse of how it was in the PS1 games. Despite the Dreamcast version having different control layouts in the settings, none of them work like the PS1 games, so I just remapped the bindings myself for a more comfortable playthrough. It's weird because RE2 on Dreamcast had fully customizable button mapping, but 3 and Code Veronica didn't. But personally, remapping the buttons was an option I did not have in the HD version, so I'm not playing this version ever again. But we've gotten off track for what the video was actually about. What's not to like about Code Veronica? I mean, it's littered with appeal for fans of the series. Beginning with this action-packed CG cutscene where Claire Redfield tears her way through an Umbrella facility before ultimately being captured and sent to a prison island in the Southern Ocean. Compared to the CG cutscenes in RE2 and 3, this one really catches your attention as it, especially for the standards of its time, looks like the kind of action scene you'd find in a high-budget movie, with significantly higher quality character models than what was on the PlayStation 1. Code Veronica also promised to be a story fans of the series wouldn't want to miss out on, the game being about the continued adventures of Claire Redfield following her journey to find Chris in Raccoon City from RE2, and also taking place after the destruction of Raccoon City from RE3. This game also promises the return of Chris Redfield to the story for the first time since RE1, which came out 4 years earlier at this point, which I can imagine must have been pretty exciting for fans who had been there since day one. On a technical level, the game was also pretty exciting back in the day. For the in-game scenes, the models actually move around and emote in ways they couldn't on PlayStation 1, including lips that move and animations that go beyond reusing the animations from gameplay. The areas are also fully modeled in 3D as opposed to the pre-rendered images used in the older games. Although while we're talking about that, I should mention that there are some drawbacks to the new hardware. It's not all next-gen appeal in this one. While having 3D modeled backgrounds is nice, it does lead to a significant decrease in the detail each area has compared to the PS1 games. By RE3, areas will be pretty rich in terms of detail, but locations in Code Veronica are largely flat and very foggy to compensate for its shortcomings. Maybe that was what the HD version was trying to correct, but the colors aren't the problem, it's just the details in the walls are lacking for a majority of the areas. The frame rate has been lowered from 60 to 30 as well. This one doesn't present a big problem, I just figured I'd mention it. What does bother me though are the much longer loading screens. I always hated these door transition load screens in the RE games, and Code Veronica has what felt like the longest ones yet, especially when they zoom in on the door and then cut to an opening animation. That reduced loading is probably the best part about the game in the HD version. And hey, if it was on PC, we could just mod out the door screens entirely. But finally, we have all that preamble out of the way. What did I not like about Code Veronica? Really, you can narrow it down to a couple of basic things that just hurt the entire experience. One of the strongest things about the classic Resident Evil series is how it goes about its exploration. In RE1, 2, 3, as well as the other games I've played, I was endlessly captivated by the simple exploration design. You would land in an area, find places you could and could not go to, find an item in a place you could go, and use it to gain access to a place you couldn't before, and then keep that structure going for a few more hours until the game is done. Code Veronica has this, but the way it works is just very unappealing. The previous games were all divided into different segments, which I outlined in the RE3 video. Sometimes these games will put all the attention into one of these areas at the expense of the others, but that's besides the point. You start Code Veronica on Rockford Island as Claire must escape the prison. From there, you gain access to the Ashford Palace, the training grounds, the airport, and the private residence in relatively quick succession. Similar to RE3, many of these areas aren't that big on their own, but getting access to them at roughly the same time leads to a very confusing first playthrough. I recall several moments where I did not know how to progress. Like how this door to the private residence is blocked by a gun-shaped key. You find the guns, but it activates a trap, so you have to put them back where you found them to escape. You need to grab this wheel from that very room in order to trigger a cutscene where Steve, a guy Claire met, gets caught in the gun trap you dodged earlier, and then you save him. Steve won't give Claire the guns and says he'll only do so if you trade him with something fully automatic. Well, you then take the wheel down to this port where you reach the airport, thinking you're making progress, and after running around here for several minutes, you realize that nothing tied to current progression was here except the biohazard key you need, because after this you need to go to the training grounds. Explore it thoroughly to reach this sequence where Claire and Steve finally make the gun trade, and you can now bring it back to the palace so you can use them to get inside the private residence, where you spend a few minutes to grab the silver key, which is used inside the palace to unlock a door that hides an eagle crest that you have to use all the way back at the beginning of the game in the prison yard to grab another key item that's needed in the palace to further progress in the private residence so you can get one of the 3 items needed to escape via the airport. I feel like the convoluted nature of this should really speak for itself. In principle, this is the same kind of design as the previous games, but with items from one area being needed in another, it creates a first playthrough that, like I said, gets really confusing. I have no problem saying I peeked at a guide in order to get through Code Veronica, because after a bit, running back and forth like an idiot starts to lose the very limited appeal it already had before. When I got through RE2 and 3 mostly on intuition, but back to Code Veronica, that's the main problem. The fact that multiple levels are open at once, it just made the game feel too big in a way. Maybe this would happen in, say, RE1, but the mansion was a fairly confined space, and so exploring it only gave you so many options to exhaust, when here it was much more open-ended, which I didn't like. Even on my second go with the game, this still presented a problem because now you need to commute from area to area. Finding the medicine bottle isn't a relieving moment, it's cause for a sigh as you have to run back to the room you literally started the game in, and that kind of backtracking just kills the pace. Backtracking is a massive game-wide problem. Right at the end of the game, I knew I needed to get the 2 jewels from this tiger statue, but moving one of them caused it to turn to that side. What you need to do is run back 3 rooms to kill the power to the area, and then the statue won't be able to move. But in my infinite luck, I didn't put the jewel back in its place, so it was still facing the side. So I had to run back to where I left the jewel and put it back in its place, run back to turn the power back on to reset the statue, then turn it back off to stop its ability to move. Then run back to grab both jewels, and then I could progress. The game was just littered with remarkably tedious busywork. Like how you can't just escape from the airport, Claire needs to get out, hit the switch which obscures your path back, making you take a detour that takes you through 2 different areas yet again just to make it back to the plane. This isn't difficult to me, it's just really monotonous. Although if you want to talk about frustration, let me tell you, Code Veronica is defined by the "what an idiot I am for my inability to predict that" principle. I'm coining that now. No greater example than halfway through the game where the perspective switches from Claire to Chris Redfield. So here I am as Claire, exhausting all my ammo on the boss against Nosferatu in the snow, and suddenly I'm Chris. This isn't a massive problem inherently, as previous games saw you switching characters, but to directly compare to the part in RE3 where you played as Carlos, RE3 did not share resources between Jill and Carlos. The developers designed the hospital segment around Carlos's limited resources. The very first thing that happens when you play as Chris is a boss fight against a giant worm. Before this, you find out that Chris and Claire can share items via the item box. If you want to, you can, as Claire, leave behind powerful items and weapons that Chris will then be able to use. For example, the worm boss literally gives you ammo for the bow gun, something I found as Claire way earlier. But my problem is, this comes with no warning whatsoever. I was just barely surviving as Claire using all my most powerful stuff against the enemies I was facing, like how I kept shooting these bug enemies with the assault rifle because I didn't know these enemies broke the series rule of enemies staying dead once defeated. So that was a bunch of ammo wasted. But then, like I said, I used all I had left in this boss fight, and then I'm Chris. And then I'm bumbling around this worm boss fight with nothing but a basic handgun because the game did not warn me of this. And they actually could have too. You play as Steve for a brief bit in the first half of the game, and maybe this could have been a good way to introduce the idea that the player can trade items between characters, and that it would be important to manage your items with that expectation. At the end of the game, you switch back to Claire, and I decided to bring powerful weapons with me, assuming this was the big chunk of gameplay, but instead, you only play as Claire for like 5 more minutes, and you don't even need ammo. All you need is health to survive this chase scene, and then she's done for the rest of the game, leaving Chris with whatever you had from before to beat the final boss. And apparently, if your resource management was bad enough, you could even get into a situation where beating the final boss will be almost undoable unless you have a save file that goes back far enough to change that, which luckily didn't happen to me. You could say poor resource management in an RE game should be punished, but not to this extent. This does not sit right with me because the problem comes from the what an idiot I am principle, which is just not fair. Playing Code Veronica a second time is like playing a completely different game. It goes by so much faster when you know what you're doing. Even then, I wasn't perfect, but it took me 3 hours to reach Chris's first segment when it took me almost 7 hours the first time, and then it took almost 12 hours to beat the game entirely. This was nothing like RE3, where I could tell I was just bad at the game and needed to play it a second time to get a better grasp of it. And since publishing my video on RE3, I've learned even more about RE3, like the fact that a separate button targets objects instead of enemies, completely fixing my issue with the final boss, and allowing me to understand why I could barely hit explosive barrels, among other in-depth features RE3 has, which Code Veronica mostly doesn't. In this game, the issue was entirely progression and items. On my second playthrough, I was hoarding health like it was nobody's business, and I had a surplus of it to go around. The same goes for ammo. The first time, I had to knife only this boss fight on the plane because I just happened to be out of ammo completely. The second run will alleviate issues with progression and items, but on the whole, I just felt like this game dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Like the part where Chris and Claire are finally reunited, and it turns out that Claire is poisoned from the boss fight I last played as her during, since I guess I was too dumb to think of healing her from that. So what does Chris have to do? He must run back the way you came to find a cure and bring it back to Claire, and then you can progress, but then they get separated and that begins the really brief final Claire segment. When this happened, I was just thinking, of course I have to go back the way I came, why wouldn't I? The game has just had an obsession with that since the very beginning. No amount of playthroughs is going to make running around these areas over and over fun for me. I just thought this game was supremely boring, and by the time I was halfway through, I was getting the sense that I really didn't want to play anymore. But on my second playthrough, I knew for a fact that I was not enjoying this game. That's why I didn't finish the second run as well. I played up to the first Chris segment because I wanted to see a few things. Does the game get faster on a second playthrough due to knowledge of what's coming, and is it more fun? The answer is yes to the first one and no to the second one, so I just dropped it when I got killed like 20 minutes into Chris's segment and had to start over. And that's a sad fact. Everything else I could add on Code Veronica just comes back to the central point. I didn't enjoy the game. There were numerous thoughts I had while playing it, like, man, it's cool how you can target multiple enemies at once with two-handed weapons like I'm Dante in Devil May Cry. Or generally speaking, the weapon selection was pretty good in this game. Claire's bow gun in RE2 fired 3 darts at once, meaning every shot will spend 3 arrows, and Code Veronica improves it to where it fires 1 at a time but still has a boatload of ammo, so that was the go-to weapon for much of the game. Claire can mod her handgun to be like Leon's in RE2, firing 3 shots at once. The grenade launcher returns with the power it had in RE2, the shotgun is as useful as ever. Across the board, I just found the weapons very useful, even the knife with its multi-frame damage output, when it was basically useless in all the previous games. I thought it was a cool detail how the game has bats for enemies, and if you equip your lighter, they'll leave you alone. I'm glad that the quick turn from RE3 came back in this game, becoming a mainstay in the controls. I was surprised at how much I didn't like stairs returning to how they were in RE1 and 2. I complimented RE3 for having stairs you naturally interacted with. I thought I was just complimenting a relatively small addition, but returning to a game where you have to give up control for several seconds just to go up and down stairs went to show how much RE3 improved it. I think the game has a pretty creepy vibe throughout, like watching a video of the Ashford twins taking the wings off of a live dragonfly and feeding it to a mound of ants. That was pretty messed up. But again, I don't like playing Code Veronica. It's the kind of game where all I can think about is how much I'd rather be playing some other game with my time, and that overshadows everything in this game. That even includes the plot. In a vacuum, I like the story of Code Veronica, although the game is working overtime to make sure I don't care. I mean, this game has some of the worst vocal performance in the series, second only to RE1. In this game's case, it's not like the actors sound as though they're coming from another planet like that game, it's just more that the delivery of the lines from Steve and Alfred Ashford are just so terrible. I do like how Alison Court still voices Claire in this game. She's the only RE actor from the 90s that continued to play her character for a decent bit after her debut in RE2. Similar to RE1, I don't mind looking past the presentation of the story to enjoy what's there though. I thought it was really cool to see Claire be this action hero type. Not the first thing I'd think of when making a game starring Claire following RE2, but I thought it made for entertaining cutscenes and dialogue with her. The main thing dragging Claire's portion of the story down is her interaction with Steve. Even looking past this lad's voice acting, the writers just make him incredibly annoying. I mean, him not giving you the guns right when he finds them is why you have to spend an extra hour looking for guns to trade with. He's not totally useless, like when he saves Claire from this one monster with the guns he won't give up, but there are more examples of him getting in the way than helping. I mean, you literally have to bumble around trying to shut off toxic gas for 20 minutes in a later area specifically because he was operating a crane and just couldn't stop looking at Claire's body and then accidentally rammed the crane into a pipe. It seems the YouTube comments love talking about this ludonarrative synchronicity thing, and this being Exhibit A. Thanks to Steve's negligence, I have to backtrack through more rooms, really tying the story and gameplay together. But in all seriousness, I did think that the story has cool moments and surprises, like how Chris comes to the island to save Claire, and that's when he learns that Albert Wesker is still alive after the tyrant seemingly killed him in RE1. But then Wesker just busts out full-on superpowers. Admittedly, Wesker kinda comes out of nowhere in the original Code Veronica, but Code Veronica X adds a cutscene where Claire meets Wesker earlier on, who mentions that he attacked the island and that caused the T-virus to leak across the island, giving his role in the story a little more context, and also building up to his first scene with Chris, because his scene with Claire first shows off that the man now has superhuman powers and a real burning hatred for Chris Redfield following the events of RE1. Speaking of previous events, Code Veronica X had been released alongside a DVD called Wesker's Report, which I watched on YouTube courtesy of a YouTuber called BlackFox2240 who uploaded the whole thing. This mini-movie is narrated by Albert Wesker as he describes in detail the events of the PS1 trilogy, giving you insight you wouldn't have known before, like how Wesker faked his own death by taking a mutated strain of the T-virus to give himself superpowers and to temporarily make it look like he was dead. That's how he came back and explains why he never died in the first place. He wanted to set Chris and Jill up to face the Tyrant at the mansion in RE1 so he could collect that combat data and sell the Tyrant to a competing company of umbrellas, whom he was working with before, even being in close contact with William Birkin, the developer of the G-Virus from RE2. Wesker explains that since he faked his own death, he had to operate from the shadows during the fall of Raccoon City, harboring a grudge against all the remaining STARS members as they foiled his plans in RE1. As he collected combat data on Nemesis when it went after Jill in RE3, and was the one who hired Ada to get the G-Virus in RE2. It also mentioned that he was the one who saved her life in the end. Some of the things mentioned in Wesker's report don't add up with where the series stands now. I mean, Wesker talks about Ada's death from the Leon A version of RE2, and the film shows footage of Claire's B ending, but by now it's established that Claire A, Leon B is the canon version of RE2. And Wesker also claims that following RE2, Leon went to work with an anti-Umbrella organization while Claire went to find Chris, beginning the events of Code Veronica, leaving Sherry to be captured by Wesker. But this was seemingly based off of an earlier version of RE4's story that was scrapped. So some details are off, but overall I thought it was fascinating to see them connect the series' story like this. Shows there was an effort to take the lore and characters they were building seriously. Wesker's report was external from Code Veronica, but even in the game, I'd say there's a lot of interesting lore to learn about. RE1 had laid the groundwork for the series' story, teaching us about Umbrella, their experiments, and their unethical practices. RE2 teaches the player about how corrupt Umbrella is, controlling every major part of Raccoon City, and then RE3 showing the devastating consequences of Umbrella's actions. Code Veronica gives more backstory to Umbrella as a company with the introduction of the Ashford family. Dr. Edward Ashford helped Oswald Spencer establish Umbrella Pharmaceuticals, but with Edward's son not being a specialist in virology, there was a fear that Spencer would take over full control of Umbrella, so he created a genetic clone of Veronica Ashford where the lineage started to maintain that presence. An accident results in a boy being born as well as a girl, with the two of them being the main antagonists Chris and Claire have to tangle with in the present day. Their creator being turned into a monster you have to face off against as well. So like I said, I think this story has a lot of interesting elements and backstory, and that build-up could have led to an exciting climax, which was certainly what the game was going for as you run around an area modeled after the Spencer Mansion's main hall from RE1. That was a cool bit of fan service. Steve gets turned into a monster and dies saving Claire. That was definitely supposed to be a good moment, even if most of the audience doesn't care about this guy by this point in the story. You see a cutscene with a super-powered Wesker getting beat by Alexia, which makes you really wonder how you're gonna beat her as a normal human, making the final blow from the linear launcher gun really satisfying as Chris and Claire escape the exploding base. But, you know, despite being able to appreciate all the stuff Code Veronica added to the story, it all comes back to the same thing I was saying a few minutes ago. Regardless of the things that I liked or didn't like about Code Veronica and the moment-to-moment gameplay, it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, my overall impression was just that I didn't like the game for all the reasons stated towards the middle of the video. Code Veronica, through its large levels and noob traps, just left me feeling bored, which is probably the worst thing I can say about a game designed for replayability like RE. As stated at the top of the video, this isn't something that brings me great joy to say either. Code Veronica is not some rushed, unfinished mess. It's just a game I didn't like in a series I've really enjoyed thus far, when I went into it hoping for the best. But it just didn't happen this time, and that's fine. If you like it, I implore you to not only keep feeling that way, but to share why in the comments section. But for myself, I probably won't be revisiting this one anytime soon. The remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 got a lot of flack for the removal of content that made the original game so unique, and I completely get that. This is the kind of game, though, where I'd be very curious to see how a reimagining would play out, because structurally, I don't think Code Veronica is that fun, so a new take would definitely be something I'm interested in seeing. The sixth generation of game consoles were an exciting period for the industry, as the new millennium had just begun with a plethora of exciting games on PS2, Xbox, and GameCube to kick off the new age. It was also an exciting time period for Resident Evil, a franchise that in just 5 years since it first released on the PS1 in 1996 had proven itself as a commercial powerhouse. I mean, by 2001 there were 4 main games, spin-offs that had already been released and many more were in development, the games got ported to several consoles, and a live-action film was around the corner too. In case you forgot, since it's been 8 months, sorry for the wait, but I reviewed Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica back in April, and we're here once more to keep it going. Before the year is up, I will have tackled Resident Evil Remake, or just Remake for short, Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil 4. So let's waste no more time and start. Nintendo's GameCube looked as though it was targeting a younger demographic than usual for Nintendo, especially in comparison to the direction the PS2 and the Xbox were going in. But they did partner with third parties for more mature titles, such as Capcom for the new mainline RE games. Spin-offs like Resident Evil Outbreak were still released on the PS2, but the new games would start as GameCube exclusives. The console also got ports of Resident Evil 2 and 3. Code Veronica got an enhanced port called Code Veronica X, which dropped on GameCube and PS2. But the first new Resident Evil game was Resident Evil, a ground-up remake of the PlayStation 1 classic in 2002. The game was then followed up with a prequel called Resident Evil 0 that released a few months later. The director of that first game and the remake, Shinji Mikami, thought that a simple port of RE1 in the modern age might not be as well received because that game's presentation and especially its localization were not up to current standards. I was making this point in a previous video, but I'll repeat it now. The leap in technology from the PS1 era to the PS2 era was unbelievable. To be fair, every console leap from the 70s to the 2000s was pretty massive, but here is where I think you can see it clearly. In 2002, the original Resident Evil was only 6 years old, being one of the earlier PlayStation 1 games, and yet designing 3D games had evolved so much in 6 years that Resident Evil 1 was ancient by 2002. You could take relatively recent games and completely overhaul them in new ways. Nowadays, gaming has become standardized to where a game from 2007 only needs a texture pack, frame rate boost, and some refinements to the handling to be a contemporary game. This is not a bad thing because that's just how standardization works. Every technology-based medium works like that. On the note of technology, this was one of Remake's most praised elements. Everything in this game feels so detailed, like a multitude of different sound effects for walking on different textures, the game even playing proper sounds for when your character has one foot on a carpet and the other foot on the ground. Visually, the game was supremely atmospheric with its use of fog and gore effects that outdid all the competition, and darker lighting throughout each of its areas. A real achievement considering the fact that Remake went back to using pre-rendered backgrounds. Code Veronica was able to get a more dynamic camera by using fully modeled environments, but the cost was that the detail in those areas compared to RE3 was a downgrade, and playing it now, Code Veronica looks a little bland and blocky in many rooms. Remake perfectly blends the 3D characters with highly detailed pre-rendered backgrounds that also come with real-time lighting effects. After playing this game for the video, I felt like the darker lighting suited the mansion much better than how the PS1 version looked. I say that because I always felt like the remake of RE2 blacking out so many rooms in the RPD just made you lose out on detail in rooms that were full of it, like the East Side office for example. I remember that Remake also darkened the areas, but I feel it works here, making the mansion and other areas feel creepier. You're exploring a giant opulent mansion built in the 1960s, so candle lighting feels more realistic than the bright rooms and hallways on PS1 and it adds to the eerie atmosphere. That case could be made for the RE2 remake as well, but I think the environments in this game were designed from scratch to look this way and have each room and area give off a unique vibe. Comparing these two isn't that important on the note of visuals alone, but the RE2 remake is one of my favorite games, so I bring it up whenever I get the chance. My main point here is that Remake looks fantastic for its time and still holds up now, and was a powerful demonstration of what the GameCube can do and how far the industry had come from the early days of 3D, as it's a night and day transition when looking at RE1 compared to its remake. Although now is a good time to mention that I didn't play the game on my GameCube for the video. A few months ago, I actually found Remake, RE0, and RE4 on GameCube at a local shop and picked them up because, as I've said in many videos, I enjoy playing 6th-gen games like this on original hardware as often as I can. I did sample the game on GameCube for a bit, hence why you're seeing GameCube footage right now, but my main playthrough was on PC. This is one of those cases where I can drop my usual anti-remaster philosophy because it's just the best way to play the game today. A lot of game remasters tend to mess with lighting effects and things of that nature in the jump between consoles, and Remake is a casual example of that. But it's good enough for me. The kind of differences only a hardcore fan would notice. It's remasters like Code Veronica HD where I have big issues with it. Unlike that remaster, the game also lets you choose between a cropped 16:9 display and the original 4:3 appearance. As the footage shows, I picked 4:3 to get the most out of each screen visually. The HD version of the game AI upscales the backgrounds and makes them look kinda smeary looking, which is something that I imagine would have taken a lot of work to overhaul given these backgrounds being pre-rendered. Which is another issue that wouldn't have cropped up if I played the game with the native resolution on original hardware, but the thing is, Remake on PC is 60 frames per second and the original game was not. Heck, the HD version isn't even 60 FPS on consoles, giving the PC version the definitive edge as it has the best gameplay experience, with some costs in lighting and backgrounds. That isn't even that bad if you ask me. You can also download a mod that skips past those dreadful door transitions between rooms. These drag the pace of the classic RE games way down. Best part of using an emulator for the PS1 games in Code Veronica was just hitting the fast forward button to get through them. Remake and Zero having mods to skip past them. So it's clear that this is the best version to play. I'd be lying if I said I was ever going to play it on anything other than PC going forward too. Moving along to how Remake is as a game, it's the same basic premise as the original. People are allegedly being eaten alive by monsters in the outskirts of Raccoon City, and the STARS Bravo team was sent in to investigate. But HQ lost contact with them, and so the Alpha team's been sent in to locate them, getting attacked by monsters and taking refuge in the Spencer mansion nearby. As the game begins, you pick between Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine at the start, as the two have gameplay differences they'll get into later and experience the story in different ways. I had played Remake once before as Jill a couple years back, and I thought the game was good, but I never thought about it much past that. As you may remember, my video earlier this year was my first time playing the PS1 version of Resident Evil from start to finish, and I really enjoyed it despite its issues. So going into Remake, now as a more solidified fan of the series, I was very curious to see what I thought of the game now, and let me tell you, this game is an absolute winner. Another topic I've discussed a lot in the past is that in video games, what a remake is can vary a lot. Some video game remakes are shot-for-shot recreations of games you've played before but with more modern graphics, and in theory, improved gameplay like the recent Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon remakes. Some remakes merely take the idea of the original and try to make a new game out of it. Resident Evil 2 is an example of that. But then, the remakes I see people point to most favorably are the ones that use the original as a starting point and greatly expand upon those foundations. The holy grail of gaming remakes seem to be Metroid Zero Mission and Resident Evil 1 for that very reason. I think the best answer to what a gaming remake is something that's not set in stone, but is rather a sliding scale from an enhanced port to a full-on reimagining. What the best approach is depends on the project and its goals, so I've enjoyed all kinds of remakes that do have different approaches. But having said that, Resident Evil definitely deserves to be in the discussion for one of the best game remakes to ever exist. No better way to prove that than by going through the game and talking about all the ways it expands upon the original, which in my opinion was already a satisfying game of resource management, exploration, and suspense. The original RE pioneered tank controls, which I explained in detail in my RE1 video. It was an excellent solution for controlling a character in 3D on a console that didn't have an analog stick when it came out. A lot of people really hate these controls with a passion, and I don't know what to say to that. It felt pretty natural to me when starting RE1. Later games improved the handling, like RE3 adding the quick turn, which made it much easier to escape encounters than it was in RE1 and 2. Remake utilizing all the improvements in handling the games had already seen, like the quick turn or being able to walk up the stairs manually. Not being able to do that in Code Veronica bothered me a lot more than it probably should have, but still, glad to see improvements from RE3 back in the games. Like I said, a lot of people don't enjoy tank controls, so the HD version of Remake did implement a new control method. The game had several settings for controls on GameCube, but in the modern version, they created a makeshift analog control scheme where you don't need to hold down a run button at all, just applying more pressure to the stick to control your speed and turning naturally with the stick. I think it handles just fine and should definitely be more than enough if you really don't like D-pad movement, but while I played, I just defaulted to using the D-pad to get around because I thought it was more precise. When you're using the D-pad, movement is relative to the character and not the camera, like I said in the RE1 video. But when using the analog stick, you'll be going forward, and then every couple of screens you'll inevitably need to stop and reorient yourself to keep moving forward. Not a big issue, but for that reason I just prefer the classic controls, and thankfully Remake has that. Or should I say, the remaster of Resident Evil Remake has an option for both. Say that 17 times fast. I wish you could fully remap buttons to your liking, as each of the classic RE games has different inputs to reach the inventory screen and to shoot and things like that. Fully customizable inputs would certainly have helped matters there, but you get used to Remake's default scheme pretty quick in my experience. Now for the actual game design. The one element of the original RE that stands the test of time will be its exploration. The open-ended nature of the mansion that saw you explore different rooms to find items to solve puzzles that allowed you to progress further into the house was a simple gameplay loop that was consistently satisfying. Even after 4 games, the Spencer Mansion's design from RE1 still held up as some of the best level design in the series. Remake had it easy in that regard because that element of the game was always going to be good if they were just going to do the original over again with new visuals and gameplay. However, the developers went the extra mile and really improved upon what was already there. A lot of this video is going to be comparing Remake to the original, and that's not to say the game isn't great on its own, because it is, but I think it's in comparison to the PS1 games where its new elements can be best appreciated. Otherwise, everything from the original that I praised back in April is still here and accounted for, so I won't repeat myself too much. In terms of layout, the mansion is pretty much the same as you remember, but it's been expanded to include new rooms like this outside patio that connects the second floor west side hallway directly to the main hall without having to go through the dining room's upper floor. Say there's an enemy there you don't want to deal with. There are many examples of new shortcuts being added to the area as you explore it, like the new backyard you can get to from the main hall. It has a space blocked by a gate, which you then reach the other side of when you get to the Crow Room puzzle on the east side of the mansion. Solving the puzzle opens this door that allows you to open the gate. Because of this, you now have a quick shortcut from the main hall to the furthest end of the east side where the door leading to the woods is at. So long commutes between areas are no longer a factor in Remake because the mansion has been subtly altered to include these new routes. But it doesn't take away from the fact that you still need to consider your approach. For example, the safe room in the east side has this door next to it, and for the first half of the game the doorknob is wobbly, and if you use it too many times it will break and you'll have to take the long way around if you want to return to this spot. Can't make it too easy, right? It's not just new rooms that make the mansion feel more fleshed out though. They've enhanced old rooms too, like this side room that was next to the Yawn's domain. In the original game, nothing is in here besides ammo and an ink ribbon. Not totally useless, but nothing important either. Remake doesn't waste any space. In that small dining room, you find a page of music notes, and this needs to be used in the bar to complete the Moonlight Sonata music sheet that opens the secret door when played. In the original game, you just found the music sheet next to the piano and that was it. Now, they've made use of an empty room while slightly increasing the amount of effort it took to get another item. Tons of puzzles have been changed or just have more laid on top of what was already there. Like how you swap the shields from the secret room in the dining room fireplace to use the grandfather clock, exactly as it was in the original, but then you need to move the hands on the clock to match the painting right next to it to be granted the key that opens the Yawn's domain. In the underground, I remember saying that it was neat how you needed to use the crank to push the statue forward, allowing you to move it. I distinctly recall saying I liked that bit in the original review. But then in comes Remake, where you have to do that, but then spin the statue around on this disc to get it in place with another statue in the wall. These aren't the most difficult brain teasers to ever grace the world of gaming, but I think it's great that Remake keeps in all the rooms and puzzles you remember from the PS1 game and expands upon them to make them take more effort to complete. This room of crows in the original game had you hit the buttons in sequence with the age of the person in the paintings. Now you have to match the colors of the stained glass windows with the painting at the end of the hall. I won't say one is more difficult than the other, but it's a change. I appreciate that change because of the fact that it keeps the remake feeling like it's the same game as the original, but it keeps players on their toes throughout. Take the jump scares, for example. They've made little changes to the timing that allows the game to still get you if you've played the original 4 times now like I have. The dogs don't dive through the window in this hallway immediately like the PS1 version, so their not being there was scarier than them actually appearing. But then when they do show up, it manages to scare you because you almost forgot about it. Opening the front door in the original triggered this funny looking cutscene that established that you couldn't leave the house, but doing that in the remake actually causes a dog to get in and you have to kill it with your precious resources, or avoid it for the rest of the game, giving you real gameplay punishment for trying to open that door. But there are plenty of examples of things you're familiar with being changed in an exciting way for veteran players. For example, I had placed the blue gem in this tiger statue like the original, but then I got the red gem where it was found in the PS1 game, but this room also included a new yellow gem. I had figured that was for something new I had to use later, but placing the red gem in the other eye of the tiger statue causes snakes to drop from the ceiling and needed to get out quickly. The yellow gem is required to get the MO disc from this tiger statue, and then the red gem is now used in this box. Another example of making changes is how you escape the mansion. Not with the various crests needed to reach the woods, but instead these masks that you need to put in the new underground grave that gives you an item to open the door to the woods. But it gets interesting when you actually do find the wind crest but are unsure of what it does because you know that it's not going to be used like it was in the original. Instead, you need to use it in the woods to activate a puzzle that gives you the Magnum, which is a must-have weapon for the finale of the game, especially as Chris, who doesn't get the arsenal that Jill does. The first time I realized that my experience with the original game didn't mean I was in for an easy time was pretty early on in my Jill playthrough, where I'd grabbed the shotgun and activated the falling ceiling just waiting for the cutscene to play that would end the scene. But then I got crushed and died and lost all my progress from the first 25 minutes or so. Technically this was possible in the original game, but I figured I must have missed the trigger for the rescue and then decided to take the slower path to the shotgun, which was replacing it with the broken one in the mantle. Although, when I sampled the game on GameCube, I had activated the falling ceiling, and it was only when I tried opening both doors did the cutscene play, so perhaps this is what I failed to do before. Not sure, to be honest. But still, it sets the stage for my having to play more carefully in the remake than I thought I was going to. A lesson learned by the time the Crimson Heads appeared in the game. One of the critiques I gave the original was that it was pretty easy to break in your favor. Killing a zombie would eliminate that enemy from the game, so therefore if you killed a room full of zombies at the start of the game, that room is completely safe for the next hour and a half of gameplay, reducing the tension by a great deal. Especially if you play that game on an edition with auto-aim and with the knowledge that handgun bullets aren't that useful at the end, so are best spent wailing on enemies at the start. This is something I realized after just playing that game once. Remake changes the dynamic completely, as the only way to kill a zombie in this game is by blasting its head or by burning it once it's knocked out. A knocked out zombie can't be killed by shooting it some more like you could in the last 4 games. My headshots weren't even that consistent when aiming the shotgun upwards like the previous games, so you're given incentive to try incineration. But to do this, you need gasoline and the lighter, which takes up 2 item slots for Jill. If you don't do this, the zombies will later rise up as a Crimson Head, a more vicious zombie that chases after you with its sharp claws. Hearing the sound it makes and seeing the zombie make a mad dash for you is probably the most tense Remake gets, as you either need to outrun it or spend resources shooting it down again. This adds strategy to the early game enemies that weren't there on PS1. Now, if you defeat a zombie, you really need to think about whether it's worth making a trip to the item box to grab the supplies it takes to burn it, or you can just try and juke the regular zombies, saving ammo and gasoline but risking taking damage, but doing so because you know you'd rather contend with a slow, regular zombie than tangling with a Crimson Head later. The way these enemies are designed also allows for Chris to feel more useful as a playable character. In the original game, Jill and Chris were basically the difficulty options. Jill had 8 item slots and Chris had 6. Jill got easier access to the shotgun than Chris and even got the grenade launcher, which Chris never did. Jill got a lockpick while Chris had to find these tiny keys that took an item slot. Chris's playthrough was without a doubt the hard mode of the game, but I felt that he never had positives that outweighed that. The comments of my first RE video told me that Chris had more health than Jill, but I never noticed that because healing items were in abundance in both campaigns, and looking past that, Jill had more weapons and item slots, making her the better character to play as in RE1. In Remake, the dynamic is similar. Jill still gets 8 full item slots when Chris only gets 6. I got tripped up with Chris needing tiny keys over a lockpick because I never had one when I needed it, so I never got the backyard shortcut open in my run of Chris's story. However, Chris has more observable benefits that Jill doesn't in this version. To list a few, Chris shoots faster than Jill, making enemies easier to dispose of with the handgun, and his rate of headshots is higher. He also does have more health like the original. Both Chris and Jill can use defensive items to escape being grabbed by a zombie. Both of them can use these daggers you find to do it with. However, each one of them gets their own exclusive defensive item. Jill getting this battery-powered stun gun that knocks zombies out, but putting her in the position of having to burn it or keep moving. Chris gets these flashbang grenades that blow the zombies up, making it so they can't come back as Crimson Heads. But even if they could, Chris still has the advantage. Chris has the lighter by default, like Jill has the lockpick, when Chris didn't get any permanent items in the original. The lighter was a good choice for him because it's needed for zombie disposal, so you only need to have the gasoline to light zombies up because the lighter isn't using an item slot like it does for Jill. And while Chris doesn't get the grenade launcher like Jill does and is forced to leave this flamethrower behind like the OG game, Chris finds his upgraded shotgun which holds more ammo before needing to reload. Actually, I went back and double-checked the wiki before speaking with authority on whether or not Jill could get that shotgun. And you can after Richard fights the snake with the shotgun. I just never went back in there because I got what I needed. So therefore, I missed out on that. But as I was saying, I'd still say Jill's story felt easier with the lockpick and 2 extra item spaces, but Chris had way more going for him than he did in the original. To the point where I could play either one when I revisit Remake, compared to the original where I'd rather not play as Chris. Everything I've said so far in this video are reasons why this game is such a superb improvement over the original version of RE in the mansion alone, which was the best part of the original game, but it really does get better from there. RE1's campaign was split into 5 distinct segments: the mansion, the guardhouse, the return to the mansion, the underground, and the lab. I thought the guardhouse was okay in the original, not as good as the mansion in terms of level design and puzzle solving and exploration, but it still had the same appeal, just in a smaller location. However, it was in the finale where RE1 started to get weaker the more it went on, the underground being too simple and was over too quickly as well. Remake really shines here. Starting with the guardhouse, or the residence as it's called now, A lot of this segment is the same as the original, but like the house, it feels better fleshed out in an area that really needed it. Achieving this in small ways, like how originally you needed to place a crate over this hole in the ground to block Plant 42 from grabbing you with its vines. Now there are 2 holes in the ground, and I had to relearn what I was supposed to do here, as you block one of the holes and climb on the crate which has a crate next to it, allowing you to safely get through both of them. Or how you need to take this spray gun and use it in this hole in the wall to kill the insects surrounding the key you need on the other side. But those are just tiny additions that make the area feel more complex. When you get to the basement on PS1, a pre-rendered cutscene would start to play where you see a shark coming after you from the shark's POV, which would make any player feel tense, but this was shockingly lame as you then walk into the only open door where you hit one of the switches that drains the water completely and the sharks are left flailing about with no ability to hurt you now. When I got to this part, I was really surprised. It felt like there was something I was missing. I mean, could they really make sharks that easy to dispose of? The answer to that is yes. In Remake, the basement of the shark was completely overhauled as you get multiple sharks chasing you from one door to the other side. Shooting the shark causes it to swim away for a bit, but it might leave you open to another one. It's short-lived but tense. Then you try to drain the water, but a big shark tries to get through the glass as you have a limited time to activate the machines needed to drain the water, then having to go down to an even lower area to retrieve a key and kill the big shark for good. It's part like this I didn't remember at all from my first playthrough of this game because it felt fairly obvious, I guess. Of course the shark room was going to be intense. It didn't stand out from the rest of the game, but after playing it in the original, I can appreciate these changes that make the whole game feel more complete. Which especially goes for the underground, which was doubled in length compared to the original. Everything about this area from the original game is still here, the boulders, the spiders, the crank, and the accompanying puzzles, but as you've come to expect by this point, it's received new content that allows it to stack up to the earlier parts of the game, including a puzzle where you have to set a box onto a platform that moves, that requires you to go back to an earlier spot where the platform and box have landed. You push the box into a compactor that reveals a broken flamethrower that you need to unlock a door in the cave. All new content. The biggest addition here being the new enemy, Lisa Trevor. Well, the concept was created for the original game but not included in the final product, something Remake was able to remedy. Throughout the game, you can find all these files written that give you more context in the mansion. This is true in the original and all the classic RE games. What Remake adds is the story of the Trevor family, the father, George Trevor, having been the architect who created the Spencer Mansion. You find his files throughout the house as after it was completed, he knew way too much and was thus a liability for Umbrella, being kidnapped and forced to explore the labyrinth he created to try and escape. But that ended in failure as he finally reached a room he couldn't get out of which just had his name written on a gravestone. He was played from the very beginning and left to die. His wife Jessica and daughter Lisa became Umbrella guinea pigs in the lab. Lisa in particular as she grew to be stronger with each test, becoming the monstrosity that Chris and Jill have to contend with in the modern day. One hit from Lisa causing you to lose like a third of your health. With this being a major enemy throughout the game that you're best off just avoiding that was never in the original at all, it becomes one of the game's defining elements as you have no idea what her deal is and become unsettled with all the letters you find throughout that allow you to piece the story of the Trevor family together. The entire plot of the game was overhauled for the better, although that should be expected. I mean, the presentation of RE1's story was just so terrible. Even the standards of game acting in the 90s couldn't save it. Critics slammed the voice acting and dialogue of RE1 pretty hard. I don't think Remake has great dialogue and voice acting. Other games in the early 2000s were a lot better than this, but it's good. Every character feels well cast at least, and the delivery is consistently decent. Certainly good enough to keep you in the experience without laughing at the game's expense, which I think is important because by the time this was released, Resident Evil was an ongoing story, so you'd want the debut game to have its story be something other than unintentionally hilarious. Since I think on paper the plot of RE1 is good and interesting, it's just buried by the presentation. This is something I went into in the RE1 video. I thought the plot, assuming you didn't know what was going to happen beforehand, actually had a few compelling mysteries going on. And you wouldn't know what was going to happen to the characters in both Chris and Jill's stories. Now you have proper cutscenes, lip-sync dialogue and all that, and characters being presented much better to back up my point. I liked this part in Chris's story where you can see he cannot read music like Jill can, so Rebecca shows up to help him with the Moonlight Sonata, but she doesn't get it perfect and he has the nerve to call out her playing. As if he could get it any better. Although speaking of Rebecca, I saw this cutscene where she was attacked by a hunter in the revisit to the mansion. I got kinda nervous here because I thought she was gonna die and I'd have to get one of the worst endings, which I had thankfully avoided in my Chris runs of the original game, but luckily I was able to save her in time. As for Jill's story, Barry's ongoing shadiness was so goofy in the original game that you would suspect he was up to something almost immediately, Wesker falling by the wayside in comparison. But here you do want to trust him at the beginning, but he's acting too shady to be able to fully do so, leading to the reveal of Wesker as a villain, someone who's given much more dignity here than in the original, coming off as sinister and calculating, which I feel he was supposed to be in 1996, but once more, the acting and lines just made him seem like a real doofus.
This is the ultimate life form. tyrant. Chris? Stop it.
The tyrant virus leaked, polluting this whole place, and unfortunately, I had to give up my lovely members of STARS.
You killed them with your own dirty hands! You son of a bitch!
No.
Oh yes, dear. Just like this.
Becca!
Don't move!
With the benefit of hindsight, the remake was able to work in details from later games to make the series' story feel more cohesive. Wesker holding onto a document written by William Birkin from RE2 as he's working on the G-Virus at this time, mentioning Alexia Ashford from Code Veronica. Maybe not something that had to be done, but the developers took that opportunity to flesh out the world of RE1 and show that the things you'd see in later games were definitely around when this game was taking place, like those games had claimed. Although, unfortunately, I still feel like the endgame was the weakest part of the entire thing for me. The lab is an okay level in both the original and this, but after the previous three, you'd hoped they'd do something exciting and new to end the game on a high note. While the rooms themselves have been redesigned to look more visually interesting, and puzzles have been reworked and all that, it's still pretty short and to the point. Plus, the final boss is still a complete joke. They decided to put the effort into redesigning this boss arena with the Tyrant, and yet it's still as simple as 6 Magnum shots to kill him. When I play this or RE1, I just save all my Magnum rounds for the lab, and you'll thus be able to tear through the enemies here and have more than enough to waste the final boss like it's nothing. The final boss might actually be the easiest part of the game thanks to this. Despite that, it's hard not to feel satisfied when you grab the rocket launcher and use it to land the final blow on the Tyrant, ending the game. In conclusion, I was blown away by Remake's quality. Like I said, I played this game for the first time a couple of years ago, and I liked it, but I never felt a calling to replay it, knowing I'd do a video on it at some point after I had reviewed the first 4 games. I knew the video was going to be positive because I already liked Remake, and I also really liked the original Resident Evil. But after having played RE1, Remake truly shined. Earlier, I was talking about what a video game remake even is/should be. It's impossible to deny that the best gaming remakes are ones like Resident Evil. This is a game that makes the original completely obsolete. I still think RE1 has its charm, and I'm sure I'll play it again in the future, but if you're looking for what the original game provided, Remake does it and then some. If you wish to revisit the Spencer Mansion as Chris or Jill, Remake has that level faithfully rebuilt with new areas, new enemies, more taxing exploration and puzzles, more decision making and resource management, and then it also has much improved later levels compared to the OG game. After finishing my Jill playthrough, I finally understood how someone might come to be disappointed by the remake of Resident Evil 2. I won't concede that it's anything below really good, since it's just such a well-designed and replayable game as I continuously have hammered home, but man, after seeing the glow-up that RE1 got with its remake, I do see why it's sad that RE2 and 3 especially didn't get that treatment. RE2's remake didn't make the original obsolete, which I always took as kind of a cool thing, and that both were unique and great in their own ways. But going back to Remake has got me thinking about how cool it would have been to see the sewers of RE2 or the lab faithfully done over but expanded like Remake did for RE1, and with the superior control of Remake just in RE2 and 3. When instead, Resident Evil 2 got entirely new levels based on the themes of the original, which produced superior content if you ask me, but at the same time you do wonder what could have been if RE2 and 3 got remade like RE1 did, instead of going for the reimagining angle. But to be fair, I don't think there exists a timeline where that happens. I mean, we didn't get Remake 2 for another 17 years after the first remake was released. That can be traced to the fact that despite the very glowing reaction to Resident Evil 2002, the sales were not that high. In fact, Shinji Mikami says that Remake actually sold quite poorly when it came out, which I think is quite a shame as Remake is easily the best classic-styled RE game. Maybe it doesn't have the action-packed highs of RE2 or 3, but in terms of solid, consistent, streamlined game design, it doesn't get any better than what Remake offered. Thankfully, this game did get a bit of a redemption arc when it got re-released in 2015, as it topped sales charts and sold over 1 million copies in just a few months, which is great. Probably part of why Capcom felt confident enough to make RE7 a more traditional horror game. But why did Remake fail when it was originally released anyway? Personally, I think it's got something to do with the GameCube's audience skewing much younger than the 17 and up the game was made for. Mature games just never sold as well as the Mario-type games. I imagine the audience for this game would have been higher on PS2, but maybe it was also franchise fatigue. Some critics did mention the tank controls and fixed angles as something they weren't fond of with Remake, with plenty of games going full third person. Maybe it seemed a little outdated. Maybe it's both combined. What we do know is that Mikami said that the perceived failure of Remake had inspired him to want to do something much different for Resident Evil 4, which was still in development at this time, compared to the classic horror style they had in mind. which is a story for another day. But that's not the next video, as Resident Evil 0 released a few months later in 2002 and will be the final fixed-camera tank-controlled RE game before RE4 released in 2005 and changed the series and the gaming industry forever.
Resident Evil 0.
I will admit, I was kind of nervous going into Resident Evil 0. I've never heard very many good things about this game, although I hadn't played it myself, so I couldn't tell you what the big issues apparently were before having played it. But like I said, RE0 had me nervous because I don't like to have a bad time. Resident Evil Code Veronica was a game I played for the first time earlier this year, and that was a game I had a poor time with because I thought it was too long and padded out and very boring. So if RE0 was to be anything more like that, I was concerned. Because at its best, I think the classic fixed-camera, tank-controlled RE games are fun. RE1, 2, and 3 on PS1 are all games I really like, 2 especially. RE1's remake on GameCube was also an incredible game, definitely the peak of the classic RE formula. My video last week covered it if you had missed it. Resident Evil 0 was also released on the GameCube a few months after Remake was released, and was the final game to use the classic RE gameplay. Clearly, Mega Man wasn't the only Capcom series guilty of being given releases on the regular back in the 2000s, but I guess the difference is that Resident Evil's actually popular, so I guess it worked out just fine in the end. So what is Resident Evil 0 all about anyway? Well, as the name suggests, it's a prequel to RE1, or rather, a prequel to the remake of RE1. The backstory of Resident Evil 1 was that the Bravo team of STARS got sent in to investigate a series of bizarre murders going on outside of Raccoon City, but STARS lost contact with the Bravo team, so the Alpha team got sent in, beginning RE1. Zero decides to tell that story that brought about the events of the first game. Zero stars Rebecca Chambers, the sole survivor of Bravo team that aided Chris Redfield in his campaign of Resident Evil 1. Rebecca and the Bravo team were searching for a missing fugitive named Billy Cohen, who has apparently killed over 20 people. Rebecca gets trapped on this moving train where every passenger was infected by the T-virus, so she has to contend with the zombies, the kinds of things nobody has ever seen before at this point in the timeline, and also Billy, who's on the train. The two must team up to escape because they have no chance of doing it alone, especially since almost the entire rest of Bravo team was wiped out by the monsters in the woods, setting up Resident Evil 0. Despite the fact that Zero doesn't have a glowing reputation amongst the coverage of it I've seen, I still went into it with an open mind. I mean, I've had cases where I went into something expecting to think one way and came out thinking something different. So RE0 was a game I was willing to give a chance and maybe see the bright side of. And heck, if I did, I could have made a hot take RE0 was actually amazing video. But I didn't like this one. We'll get into all the reasons why in a bit, but I figured I'd mention that RE0 does have positives, and some of those positives are technical improvements from Remake. That game had some very nice looking pre-rendered backgrounds with excellent real-time effects. RE0 has all these things going for it as well. What I thought was better in Zero was that the camera will occasionally pan when you're still on one screen. Helps the areas feel more 3D. Zero also has way more CG cutscenes. In Remake, the live-action opening of RE1 was done over as a CG cutscene, and then the game had some pre-rendered scenes like the shark attack, but mainly used in-engine cutscenes before the brief endings of each campaign. Zero uses CG cutscenes more often throughout the campaign, and I think they look decent, even when upscaled in the remaster. And playing the game for the first time 20 years after its release, I can say this looks good for the standards of its time and passable today. Even creating different versions of the CG cutscenes that play depending on which character you were playing as. And lastly, there's the music. I didn't talk about it during the Remake review, but that was actually the one part of the game I didn't really care about as much. Remake does use some of the same melodies from the PS1 original, but I thought they were much catchier in the OG game, as the Remake was going for a more atmospheric, spooky vibe for its music, which was a bit disappointing considering the fact that I thought RE1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica all had great music that managed to be eerie at just the right moments anyway. Zero was a big step up in the soundtrack department for me, having climactic sounding themes for bosses and some catchy tunes for the main levels. Although the music doesn't continue between screens in this game, the tracks just start over. I only noticed that because in this one basement level, the track starts with this sound. And every time I heard it, my brain immediately thought of the Shredder's theme in the 2003 TMNT series, for the 2 people watching this video who would even get that. So, I had a major problem with RE0 from the very beginning, and it's one that isn't even the game's fault, but rather the remaster. In hindsight, I'm glad I mentioned the button mapping in my Remake video because it really became a problem when I started playing Zero. This game already makes changes to the RE formula that took some getting used to, but that was even worse with how muscle memory impacted the play experience. The games were never super consistent with button mapping. RE1 mapped the inventory to start, and RE2 changed it to the circle button. Code Veronica had swapped the run button and the interact button. But then Remake brought it back to the way it was before. In Zero, the square button is your inventory and the circle button is the run button. It just felt so awkward, especially after 2 playthroughs of Remake, and I imagine I'm not the only person who has this issue. I mean, the HD editions of Remake and Zero were released back to back and now are sold together as a bundle. I'm willing to bet countless players have been impacted by this awkward control scheme because it's literally flipped from how Remake controlled. Zero, like several other RE games, has multiple control setups, but none of them let you play it the way you could in Remake, which was also true in Code Veronica not letting you play it like the PS1 games despite having different layout options. A simple solution would just be custom button mapping, but we don't have that. I'm not kidding when I say that the worst part of starting Zero for me was opening the inventory when I meant to use the run button. It was very cumbersome. In my first session, the main thing I used to combat this was changing the control scheme to where L2 aimed and R2 fired your weapons, taking that action off the face buttons and then using the new analog controls I didn't find a use for in Remake as my way to avoid needing to hold down the run button entirely in Zero. But that just felt like a temporary fix, since I still think the D-pad control is a lot more precise in the classic RE games. I mean, seriously, look at me trying to turn this corner with the analog stick compared to the D-pad. So between sessions 1 and 2, what I did was download an app that allows you to remap the control bindings of any game you choose, and with that I altered the controls to be like Remake, and suddenly Zero was a lot easier to play. Playing the game on GameCube felt pretty natural in terms of button mapping, and perhaps that's another argument for sticking strictly to OG hardware, but since most people will be playing Zero like this, it makes sense to tell the people about the control snafu I ran into. Once I was past that, there was the matter of the actual game design. RE0 stars 2 characters, Rebecca and Billy, but this is a more involved part of the game than ever before. You don't pick one character for the whole campaign or trade off in scripted sections like RE2 through Code Veronica. Instead, you play as both characters at the same time. Imagine the part where Leon and Ada traveled to the cable car in RE2, but Ada was a character you could switch to with her own inventory screen. Once Rebecca and Billy have teamed up, you can press one button to switch between the two of them and another button to split up or regroup. By default, the partner character will follow you automatically, but if that's not good enough for you, you can control the partner character's movement with the right analog stick, while moving the player character with the left analog stick. I'd say RE0 does the best of the games so far at making the two characters feel different. I said last week that I didn't even notice PS1 Chris had more health compared to Jill, but then on RE0, Billy is like a tank in terms of damage. You get hit by the toughest of enemies at full health with him and he'll still be in the green. But Rebecca is made of glass by comparison. You will not last long when getting hit by the toughest enemies as her. But Rebecca has the knowledge on how to mix herbs together for greater health restoration that Billy does not. Billy can move heavy objects and Rebecca can't. Although that just tells me that Rebecca needs to work out more. I mean, Sherry Birkin could move heavy objects in RE2 when she was like 6 years old. In all seriousness, I feel like this aspect of Zero was actually pretty interesting. Controlling the characters is easy to handle, the AI on the partner was reliable when I was stuck in a jam, and switching between them felt pretty intuitive. This has the potential for strategizing repeat playthroughs. For example, early in the train level, you have to get outside and walk over to one car and fix something, but this sends whichever character you're playing as falling back into the hole in the ceiling behind you that they can't get out of. So you need to switch to the other character to find an item they need to escape that room. I happened to be playing as Billy when this first happened to me, so Rebecca had to help. But then I was met with this crab boss I wasn't sure of how to dispose of, so I died pretty quick. When reloading the save file, I decided to switch characters, and that's when I saw just how much more health Billy had over Rebecca. The boss isn't actually that hard, I just didn't know you had to aim down at its head first. I do have an issue with the game dropping things unexpectedly on you like this, which I'll talk about in a moment, but in theory, I'm sure you get what I mean when I say the potential for good strategy is built into RE0, as repeat playthroughs will allow you to plan out which characters you'd want to do certain things as. In terms of structure, there's not too much to say on Zero, it's pretty much the same as the other games. You play various levels like the train, the training facility, the laboratory, the factory, and the treatment plant. Some of these are way longer and more complex than others, but in each area, you should know the drill by the 6th RE game. You start each area by searching all the rooms that are open for items and puzzles that will allow you to enter rooms you couldn't before that will also contain more items that will further allow you to progress until you find the things you need to escape. RE0 is no different from the previous 5 games on that front. Zero is all about the partner mechanic. Resource management has always been an integral part of the RE games, and now you have to manage 2 characters at once, which comes with advantages like swapping ammo and supplies, but also drawbacks like having 2 health bars to worry about at all times and losing your progress if the partner character dies. That alone, I think, is an interesting system that makes the typical RE exploration, puzzle-solving formula stand out in this game. As I have said, you'll need to use both characters effectively to solve certain puzzles and get through combat encounters. That much I think works about Zero. However, I think RE0 is very over-designed. What I mean is that this game makes changes to the formula that I don't think add anything besides fixing what wasn't broken. Let's begin with the fact that there is no item box in Zero. It was a simple concept. You deposit items you didn't want to carry anymore in the item box, and then when you found an item box later in the game, all the things you put in the previous item box would magically be in there. Doesn't make any sense, but it works from a gameplay perspective. Zero fixes something I've been irked by in all the previous games. It was impossible to just toss out items you didn't need anymore. If you had opened all the doors locked by a certain key, the game would let you toss it out, but that was it.
If you had something like the knife or the ink ribbons that were taking up item space, you would need to deposit it at an item box. This was never a large issue, but still, a discard item button would have been useful, especially in Chris's campaign of RE1 and Remake where his lack of item slots got in my way a few times. Zero finally lets you get rid of everything you're currently holding on to, only it doesn't erase it from the game like later games do, it just drops the thing on the ground, you can pick it up later at any time. This much I think is a decent idea. You've got to put more decision making into what items you're going to carry and when you're going to drop them, but in practice, I'd rather we just have an item box. Here's why. It doesn't produce a meaningful change in the gameplay, it just makes things more complicated than they need to be. For example, I'm just going to drop ink ribbons next to the typewriters, which were always next to item boxes in the previous games anyway. So now, you'll have a few ink ribbons next to this save point and a few more next to that one, maybe some knives and things like that hovering around the typewriter when, like I said, an item box would have served the same purpose and would have cut down on the tedium a lot. In Zero, when I find Magnum ammo, I have no reason to take it with me. In previous games, I'd store it in the item box and then get to use it when I finally had the Magnum. In this game, I'd inevitably have to leave behind ammo for a weapon I don't have, and then when I got said weapon, I'd need to run all the way back to wherever the ammo was left on the ground. Or when I had to leave the grapple gun behind, and then when I needed it, I had to run all the way back to where I left it. When if there was an item box in the safe room right next to where the gun was needed, the tedium would have been greatly cut down. This is what I mean. None of this creates a meaningful change to the gameplay, it just adds extra steps to what was already a figured out science in RE1. But that's not the only obstacle to inventory management in Zero. Both Rebecca and Billy have 6 item slots each, which already dampened how much freedom Chris had in exploration in RE1 and Remake. You could say that with the two of them combined, you have 12 item slots technically, and from a certain point of view, that's true. But Zero makes it to where that space is going to be cramped quickly. Both characters have their own handgun, and to reload, you need to hold on to that ammo with that character. Sometimes I would have one character hold on to all the ammo and then give some away to the character needing it, but then other times I decided to have both characters hold on to their own ammo because if you were forced into a section where you could only play as one of them, I guess you would just be screwed for not thinking of that beforehand. But then, two-handed weapons also take up 2 item slots when they never did before. This is another pointless addition that makes inventory management more of a pain than it needs to be. I gave Code Veronica criticism for embodying the "what an idiot I am" for my inability to predict that principle, but this game is even worse with that. Code Veronica suffered from that in a few select moments that would probably trip you up if you weren't expecting them, but definitely not one of the more important issues in that game. No, this principle is the biggest issue I had with Resident Evil 0 across the board. Session 2 was easier to play because I had fixed the controls, but now I have new problems. Like this part where Billy lifts this massive object that allows Rebecca to grab the key that was under it, but then Rebecca gets grabbed by a giant centipede-looking thing, so you must play as Billy to save her. But when I got here, I had no health left as Billy, so I couldn't get too close or I'd die. To make matters worse, I didn't have any ammo on hand as Billy either. Rebecca was carrying most of it. Sorry, I did not know I was about to do a boss fight at this exact moment. What an idiot I am for my inability to predict that. Even then, I still died here multiple times because I didn't know the monster was only weak when it exposed its chest every now and again. I just played it like any other RE boss where you aim and shoot and then win. Not that making bosses require more strategy and timing is an issue, I'm just saying that a whole host of things went wrong for me here. And this was a consistent problem for me when playing Zero. Like when Rebecca falls through a hole in the ground and needed to run out of the current area into the boiler room basement just to reach where she was at. I mean, to be fair, the last thing we did was activate a switch that shut the steam off in the boiler room, but my first thought was going to the room Rebecca was in to save her, not run to several rooms away first. Alright, we got the battery needed out front to move this elevator that has the container we need to climb up on and get this item, but oh crap, you can't get behind the container? I have to send Billy all the way back up the entire map just to get him on the elevator too? Just so much extra busy work. Now I'm fighting a giant bat thing and the auto-aim is going ballistic, targeting every bat on the screen but the big one flinging me in the air. Oh, alright, that's finally done. Oh, I need to mix this red mixture with a green mixture, but I'd already passed the green mixture completely earlier. Well, that one's on me for not looking at something as obvious as that, but now I have to backtrack the way I came, and of course, I don't have any good weapons for Rebecca at this moment and got destroyed by these tiny ape-looking zombies, leaving me with no health as Rebecca for the next several moments of gameplay. This became really bad because I had finally gotten through the lab area and could ride this cable car, but this locked me into a cutscene where Billy goes flying over the edge with an enemy and Rebecca is attacked by this obnoxious leech enemy. You'll encounter this early on in the training facility and quickly be overwhelmed by how this thing moves around very fast and has incredibly long reach with his stretchy arms. And it's also indestructible to conventional weapons. It's not actually indestructible, I just wanted to reference a Slide 2 line. Feels like it's been a while since I last did that, gotta get it in. But as I was saying, the human leech is a bullet sponge, so your only defense is mixing these empty bottles with gasoline to become Molotov cocktails. This is the thing the leech is weak to. But this part where Rebecca is forced to kill one came right after the thing I just talked about. I had no health left, so I kept getting killed within 2 seconds because of the reach this monster has and at such high speed. The cocktails are too slow when tossing them and take too long to recover from, so even when I had that, it still took several tries. But hey, at least I got a health pickup right after that, right? But that's when you're tossed into a battle with a tyrant monster. Good thing we just got the Magnum or I'd be screwed. Also, good thing I didn't use too much ammo for said Magnum on these 2 hunters I had to waste. I hope the point I'm making is clear here. It's not that RE0 can't have challenge or things that come as a surprise to players. The issue with RE0 is that there are too many things that come up you'd have no ability to prepare for. As is standard in this series, a second playthrough would alleviate these issues a lot, and you could have fun mentally planning out your preparations for certain gameplay segments via items used and not used and such. But that goes for all these classic RE games. However, the first 3 games and Remake never left me feeling completely blindsided or frustrated. The closest that we ever got was RE3's bosses, and after a 3rd playthrough of that game, yeah, I still think they're pretty obnoxious to contend with. But in the moment-to-moment gameplay, the games I have liked have never made me feel like this. My attempted second run of Code Veronica just left me feeling bored out of my mind more than anything else. With Zero, it doesn't really matter how much easier I would find the game on a second go-around. I don't want to play this again because my biggest takeaway with the experience was that I did not like it. I felt very annoyed at multiple instances. Annoyed in a game already filled with fundamental elements I didn't like. While playing it, I couldn't help but wonder if RE0 was trying to be different in so many ways because of the fact that Remake didn't sell as well as Capcom had anticipated. They knew they wanted to do something different following Remake, but Zero was still in active development, set to release later that year. But I was actually wrong about that theory. RE0's development goes all the way back to the N64. Just look at the screen. That's definitely the RE0 train, but with PS1 era graphics. Development was shelved due to issues with the N64's cartridge space, eventually just resuming development on the GameCube. I bring that up because it busted a hole in my theory that this game was trying to do different things as a response to Remake. It wasn't like that. Clearly they just had a hell of a time getting this game off the ground. Its position as a Rebecca-centered prequel to RE1 that opened on a train seemed to be the consistent element though. Although I'm imagining the story went through a lot of rewrites in the process, as the plot we got decided to go all in on fleshing out other games in the series. I already said Zero details the failed mission of the STARS Bravo team that kicked off the whole series, but also showing Albert Wesker working from the shadows before the events of RE1 alongside William Birkin from RE2. This game exploring Wesker and Birkin's training to become Umbrella team members through the files you find at the training facility. The whole plot revolves around Dr. Marcus, the researcher of the leeches who created the progenitor virus that later became the T-virus. Oswald Spencer put out a hit on Dr. Marcus, but the leeches in his system took years trying to revive him and now he's back with a grudge, becoming the main threat that Rebecca and Billy have to contend with, while Wesker plans the STARS Alpha Team mission of RE1. The coolest thing Zero does to tie into other games is taking the cable car to escape the lab, where you then arrive at the marshalling yard from Resident Evil 2. It's fully rebuilt down to the exact rooms, like the security console where the tyrant attacks the B-scenario character. Rebecca rides the elevator down to the lab of RE2, but you can't actually go in there. Instead, you need to go to the other side of the bottom floor to reach the true final level of RE0. This bit of classic level design did get me thinking, perhaps they intended to remake RE2 on GameCube like RE1, but just didn't get to it because of Remake's sales issue I mentioned before. That fact, again, just gets me wondering what could have been. I bring this up, really just so that I can say I talked about RE2 Remake, one of my favorite games. At this point, every single RE video I have ever done has either mentioned it or it's been about it directly. It's like a new tradition at this point. Might as well keep it going. But anyway, I was discussing Zero's story. Overall, I enjoyed it. I felt Rebecca trusted Billy pretty fast for an escaped con, allegedly guilty of killing 23 people. However, it was pretty obvious there was going to be more to the story than we initially realized. What actually happened was that he was a US Marine and they were sent to intervene in an African civil war, which resulted in the slaughtering of a village that Billy wanted nothing to do with in opposition to the rest of his unit, but is being used as a scapegoat in an attempted cover-up. All the plot information Zero gives out is pretty interesting, however by the end I felt like a lot of it was pretty superfluous. Now we have more backstory on the T-virus, which is good. We see Wesker and Birkin working together, that's fine fan service. Rebecca and Billy are good enough characters to carry a game, but I feel like my understanding of the RE universe would be relatively the same if I had not played this game, which isn't exactly high praise for a prequel. The voice acting also feels like a step down from Remake. That game wasn't setting the world on fire in that domain, but here it just feels like the line reads are more stilted and goofy than before. Then you have the fact that characters who were in Remake and Zero have different voices like Rebecca and Wesker. It's also a thing that the guy who voices Wesker in Zero first voiced him in Code Veronica but didn't voice him in Remake and then came back for Zero later in the year and then played him for the final time in Resident Evil 4.
I could not for the life of me figure out why something like that happened, but I was digging around and found this interview with the actor who played Wesker in Remake, and according to him, the 2 games after Remake were recorded in Canada and had to use Canadian actors, before they got more consistency starting in RE5. Although technically I don't have any proof of any of that. I found this topic so interesting because I feel like voice consistency for the characters is pretty important in games. But Capcom is so inconsistent with the RE voice actors that they put Sega to shame. There have been 7 voice actors for Chris in the game continuity alone, but I suppose that's a topic to explore in later RE videos. In the meantime, I can give Zero this at least. I thought the final level was not bad. Besides this box puzzle where if you do something wrong you have to leave the room and do it from the beginning, and without a guide I feel like this amounts to little more than just trial and error. But really though, other than that, I thought the last level was fine. The puzzles are all fairly predictable by this point in the game, like one character operating a forklift and the other character standing on the box that the lift is moving to grab a key that's higher up. And there are some odd moments like how this giant frog thing showed up and grabbed the character I was playing as, but didn't attack at all. However, I just appreciate how save points came at just the right moments. Supplies were always given when you needed them, like the materials for flames when the leeches showed up again. And I had a decent supply of health and ammo for the final boss, which is good because it's pretty lengthy. Starting with you running around this room trying to shoot it, and then escaping on an elevator, and then having to distract the monster with Billy so Rebecca can get the roof opened, as Billy gets the final blow on the monster with his magnum, now that it's been exposed to sunlight. With that said, RE0 just kinda ends. Rebecca declares that she's going to pretend Billy died today so he can get away, never to be seen again in the series. She also finds the Spencer Mansion, setting up her appearance in RE1, although it's funny to think that Rebecca just survived all this, fighting hunters and tyrants with grenade launchers and shotguns, but then the next day RE1 happens and she's just got a handgun on hand and that's it. Either way, RE0 ended and I felt pretty relieved. When considering what I thought about RE0, it was tough to put into words. Do I hate RE0? No, that word is reserved for games I actively had a negative experience with. I guess you could say Zero was a game I had a negative experience with, to the point where I'd say I enjoyed Code Veronica more than Zero, but that's the thing. Zero isn't some unplayable mess or is so boring and frustrating that it's beyond the brink of redeemable. It's got decent production values for the time it was released and has much of the same exploration appeal that the previous games had. It's buried beneath the campaign I just didn't find fun because of obnoxious blindsides or things being overly complicated, thus dampening my experience. So I'm not going to say RE0 is a piece of crap, I'm just going to say that I didn't enjoy it. It's a D- compared to the D+ I'd give Code Veronica. Not like I have much interest in a scoring system, I'm just saying how it compares to the other games. I just don't feel passionate about not liking Zero now that I beat it. I just don't want to play it again, and this review detailed why, and that's all that really matters. Looking at the response RE0 got from critics, it was positive overall, praise being given to the graphics in particular, but critics were split on the new gameplay additions for this one. Some thought it was a refreshing change of pace, and others more like me and thinking that it was just needlessly complicating something that was already fine before. Where critics were consistent was in their belief that the fixed camera, tank-controlled Resident Evil gameplay had become obsolete, with games like Devil May Cry having figured out how to comfortably do fixed cameras with analog control. If Remake's response made Capcom believe that it might have been time to do something new with Resident Evil, I'm sure critics saying consistently that the formula had worn out its welcome by RE0 only further backed up that decision to change things up for the next installment. Which is where I want to end this video. Next up is finally that change I've been talking about. Resident Evil 4, which was released in 2005. One of the most influential video games of all time and a personal favorite of mine. So we will explore all of that in the next video.
And now that we've reached the end of this little look back, the next video will be a compilation of the action RE games, where I'm going to be talking about Resident Evil 4, 5, 6, and then throwing in 7 and 8 and the remake of RE4 as well. And then that'll be it for this little month of Resident Evil that I've had. So, hope people are looking forward to that. In the meantime, I say thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.